There is something strange about a secret that everyone already knows. The Manhattan Project, the program that built the first atomic bomb, is one of the most documented, studied, and retold stories in modern history. Books, films, museums, entire careers built around it. And yet, if you start pulling on certain threads, you find gaps, not dramatic ones, not movie-style cover-ups with men in black suits burning files at midnight, just absences, quiet places where records should be but aren't. Questions that historians raise in footnotes and then sort of move past. This is not a story about whether the bomb was real. It was. This is a story about what happened around it, beside it, beneath it, the parts that got filed away somewhere, or maybe never filed at all. The parts that make you wonder, just a little, what else was going on. There is a version of this story that starts with physics, with equations on a chalkboard, with a letter that Einstein signed and Roosevelt read. That version is real and it matters. But it is not where I want to start tonight. I want to start with a bus driver. Imagine you are driving a bus in rural Tennessee sometime in 1943. Your route is new. It did not exist 6 months ago. You pick up passengers at a gate, a real gate, with guards, and you drive them to buildings you have never been inside. You drop them off, you wait, you drive them back every single day, and you do not know what they are doing in those buildings. You are not told, you do not ask, partly because you were told not to. And partly because something about the whole arrangement makes asking feel like the wrong move. That bus driver knew a secret, not the content of it, just the shape of it, just the outline. And that, in a way, is exactly how the Manhattan Project worked. It is easy to think of secrecy as a thing that happens at the top. Generals deciding what generals know. Scientists with clearances and locked briefcases. But the Manhattan Project was not small enough for that kind of tidy secrecy. At its peak, it employed around 130,000 people. Some estimates go higher. Those people needed housing, food, medical care, transportation, schools for their children. They needed bus drivers and plumbers and cafeteria workers, and all of those people were in some way inside the secret without being inside it at all. That is the first strange thing about this story, not the physics, not the politics, the sheer human scale of keeping something this size quiet. When historians talk about the Manhattan Project, they usually frame the secrecy as a military achievement, and in some ways it was. The project ran from roughly 1942 to 1945. 3 major sites, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington State, Los Alamos in New Mexico, plus dozens of smaller facilities scattered across the country. Each site was compartmentalized. Workers at Oak Ridge were enriching uranium, but most of them had no idea that was what they were doing. They operated machines, monitored gauges, followed procedures. The procedures were designed so that no single person had to understand the whole picture. That word, compartmentalization, is worth sitting with for a moment. It sounds clinical, bureaucratic, like something from an organizational management textbook. But what it actually meant, in practice, was that the people building one of the most consequential weapons in human history were deliberately kept ignorant of what they were building. They were managed the way you might manage separate pieces of a puzzle, each piece handled by someone who has never seen the box, never seen the picture on the lid. The question that comes up later, the question that becomes uncomfortable later, is what happens to records kept inside that kind of structure. Because compartmentalization does not just shape what workers know. It shapes what gets written down and who writes it and where it goes when the project ends. If your job is to monitor a gauge and record numbers, you write down numbers. You do not write down why. You do not write down what the numbers mean. You do not have that information. So the record you leave behind is technically complete. It has your name, your date, your data, but it is incomplete in a way that cannot be filled in later because the person who could fill it in was somewhere else. In another building, in another compartment, and their record has its own gaps. This is not a conspiracy. Not yet. This is just what it looks like when something very large tries to keep itself secret from itself. The project was overseen by the Army Corps of Engineers. The administrative office was called the Manhattan Engineer District, which is where the project got its name, a name chosen specifically because it sounded mundane. Because if you were intercepting mail or monitoring phone calls, Manhattan Engineer District sounds like road repairs or municipal planning. It sounds boring. That was the point. General Leslie Groves ran the military side of it. He was not a scientist. He was a logistics man. He had just finished overseeing the construction of the Pentagon, which at the time was the largest office building in the world. And the reason Groves was chosen was not because anyone expected him to understand nuclear physics. He was chosen because he understood how to build something enormous very fast and keep it functioning. He understood supply chains and labor and the particular kind of institutional control that keeps a large operation from unraveling. Groves was also, by multiple accounts, deeply aware of the record-keeping problem. He knew that a project this size would generate an almost incomprehensible volume of paperwork. Contracts, personnel files, research logs, procurement records, construction documents, security reports, communications between sites, and he made decisions early and deliberately about how that paperwork would be handled. Some of it was centralized. Some of it was kept only at the site level. Some categories of documents were flagged from the beginning as requiring special handling, meaning restricted access, restricted distribution, restricted retention. That last word, retention, is one that archivists use a lot. It means how long a record is kept before it is legally eligible to be destroyed. And in a wartime military program, retention policies were not always consistent, not always followed, and not always survived the chaos of a project winding down. When the war ended and the Manhattan Project transitioned into what would eventually become the Atomic Energy Commission, the question of what to do with all of that documentation became genuinely complicated. Some records were transferred. Some were retired to storage. Some almost certainly did not make the transition at all. And here is where the first real question starts to form. Not a dramatic question, not a smoking gun, just a quiet one. The kind that sits in the back of your mind when you are reading through archival finding aids late at night, and you notice that certain record groups have gaps that are listed as, and this is the actual language used, unaccounted for in transfer. Unaccounted for in transfer. That phrase appears in more than one finding aid connected to Manhattan Project records. It is a bureaucratic phrase. It does not mean stolen. It does not mean destroyed on purpose. It might mean that boxes got lost in a move. It might mean that a filing system changed and records were recategorized in a way that broke the trail. It might mean that someone made a decision about what mattered and what didn't, and that decision wasn't documented. It might mean several things at once. The honest answer is that we don't always know, and that not knowing is not the exciting kind. It is the quiet, slightly unsatisfying kind that you carry with you rather than resolve. But before we get deeper into the gaps, it helps to understand what we do have. Because the record is not empty, it is actually quite large. The National Archives holds millions of pages of Manhattan Project documentation. The Department of Energy has published extensive declassified collections. Historians have spent careers in this material and produced serious, careful work. The Manhattan Project National Historical Park has worked to preserve physical sites and oral histories, so we are not talking about a black hole. We are talking about something more like a very large, detailed map, a map of something real and important and genuinely studied, that has certain regions marked with a notation that says, essentially, survey incomplete. Those regions are what this story is about. And the first one, the one worth sitting with tonight, in the quiet, is the simplest and maybe the most interesting. It is the question of how you maintain a secret across 130,000 people, across hundreds of facilities, across 3 years of wartime pressure, and what that maintenance costs. Not morally, yet, just structurally. What it costs in terms of the integrity of the record itself. Because when you compartmentalize knowledge, you also compartmentalize accountability. And when you compartmentalize accountability, the record that survives is not really a full record. It is a collection of partial records held by people who each understood a piece and assembled after the fact by people trying to reconstruct something they were never meant to see whole. That reconstruction is ongoing. It has been ongoing since 1945. And some of the pieces have never turned up. There is a detail that tends to get lost in the bigger narrative. When workers arrived at the Manhattan Project sites, Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos, they signed papers. Security agreements mostly. Statements acknowledging that they understood certain information was classified and that they agreed not to discuss their work. Standard wartime procedure, at least on the surface. But what those agreements actually required in practice went further than most people realize. Workers were asked not to discuss their jobs with their spouses, not to write about their work in letters home, not to speculate, even privately, about what the facility was producing. Some workers reported being told that if they were asked what they did, they should say they worked in a factory. What kind of factory, they were not to say. There were security officers on site whose job was to monitor compliance. Not aggressively, not in some theatrical surveillance state way, but steadily. Conversations were sometimes reported. Mail was sometimes reviewed. There were informants, not a formal network exactly, but a loose, ambient presence of people who would pass along anything that seemed like a security risk. And the thing is, most people complied, not because they were afraid, though some probably were, but because the war was real and the idea that loose talk could cost lives was not abstract in 1943. It was immediate. It was personal. People had family members overseas. The posters on the walls were not subtle. The message was consistent. What you know, you keep. So the secrecy worked, more or less. There were breaches, we know that now, we will get to that, but the general shape of the secret held. The bomb was built and used before the broader public, or most of the world's governments, understood what had happened. What interests me, sitting here thinking about it, is not the secrecy itself. It is the texture of it, what it felt like from the inside. Because those 130,000 people did not all go home after the war and immediately start talking. Some of them never talked, not really, not in any detailed way for the rest of their lives. Partly habit, partly residual caution. Partly, and this is something that shows up in oral histories collected decades later, a kind of uncertainty about what they were actually allowed to say, even after the project was public knowledge. The bomb was announced in August 1945. The basic facts became public. But the specific details of what each facility had done, what each process had involved, remained classified at various levels for years afterward. And the workers who had spent 3 years being told not to talk had, by then, internalized that instruction in a way that was hard to simply reverse. Some of them were never formally debriefed, never told, here is what you can now discuss, here is what remains restricted. They just went home, and the institutional knowledge they carried, the procedural knowledge, the on-the-ground understanding of how things actually worked day to day, went home with them, unrecorded. That is a different kind of missing record, not a document that was classified or lost or destroyed. Just knowledge that existed in people's heads and was never written down, and then eventually ceased to exist when those people died. Historians have a term for this. They call it tacit knowledge, and it is genuinely irretrievable. You cannot FOIA someone's memory. General Groves was aware of this problem too, to some extent. He commissioned a formal history of the project, which was written during and after the war, and eventually became the basis for published accounts. But that history was written under his oversight, with his approval, and with his clear sense of what the project's story should be. It is a useful document. It is also, by its nature, a selective one. The question of who controls the first draft of a historical record is not a small question. Groves understood that. He was deliberate about it. The official history he oversaw emphasized the scientific achievement, the organizational success, the speed and scale of what had been accomplished. It did not dwell on the costs, the uncertainties, the internal debates, or the darker edges of the research happening alongside the main effort. Those things were not absent from the record entirely. They existed in other documents, in other files, in other corners of the archive. But they were not in the front-facing story, and for a long time the front-facing story was what most people knew. There is something worth noticing about that, not accusatory exactly, just worth noticing. When an institution controls the initial framing of its own history, the gaps in that framing do not look like gaps. They look like the edges of the story, like the natural boundaries of what happened. It takes time, sometimes decades, for researchers to find the documents that reframe those edges, to show that what looked like the boundary of the story was actually a wall, and that there was something behind it. Some of those walls, in the case of the Manhattan Project, have come down. Some of them have come down slowly, and some of them are still, depending on which records you are looking for, standing. There is one more thing I want to mention before we move into the specific documents and the specific gaps, and it is this. The Manhattan Project did not end cleanly. Projects that large almost never do. When the war ended, the infrastructure remained, the scientists remained, the knowledge remained. The facilities at Oak Ridge and Hanford continued operating, repurposed into the peacetime nuclear weapons program that would eventually become the Cold War arms race. Los Alamos continued as a weapons laboratory. The personnel shifted, but the institutional culture, the compartmentalization, the classification reflexes, the assumption that certain kinds of information required special handling, that culture carried forward. Which means that some of the record-keeping decisions made during the Manhattan Project were not decisions made for a program that was ending. They were decisions made for a program that was transforming. And the records generated in those early transformation years, the late 1940s, the early Atomic Energy Commission period, are in some ways even harder to trace than the wartime records because they exist at a bureaucratic seam. They belong to one institution that no longer exists and another institution that has been reorganized multiple times since. Archivists who have worked in this material describe it as a provenance problem. Records were generated, transferred, retransferred, recategorized. Finding aids don't always agree with each other. Box numbers referenced in one document don't always correspond to boxes that can be physically located. Some records that should have been transferred to the National Archives were apparently retained by successor agencies, and their current location is either classified or simply unknown. Unknown is a word that appears more often in this archive than you might expect. Not missing, not classified, unknown. That distinction is interesting. Missing implies something was there and is now gone. Classified implies something exists but is being withheld. Unknown implies that the institutional memory of whether a record ever existed and where it went has itself been lost. And when you sit with that, when you really think about what it means for a government program of this historical significance to have records whose existence is simply unknown, you start to understand why this story does not have a clean ending. Not because someone is hiding something dramatic, maybe someone is or was. But even if no one ever deliberately hid a thing, the structure of the project itself, the compartmentalization, the scale, the transition across institutions, the culture of secrecy that outlasted the project would have produced exactly this kind of archive. Large, detailed, serious, and quietly incomplete. That is what we are working with, and in the next part of this story, we are going to start looking at specific documents. Specific records that came out later than they should have, or came out in ways that raised questions, or came out incomplete in ways that researchers have been trying to understand ever since. Because the gaps are not evenly distributed, they cluster. They appear more frequently around certain topics, certain time periods, certain categories of research. And when gaps cluster, that is when you start wondering whether the incompleteness is really just the noise of a large bureaucratic system or whether it has a shape. Shapes are interesting. Shapes suggest something. We will look at the shape. Declassification is not a heroic process. I think people sometimes imagine it that way. A researcher finds a smoking gun. A judge orders a release. Sunlight floods in. But the reality is much slower than that, and much stranger, and the documents that come out are often not dramatic in themselves. They are memos, personnel evaluations, procurement logs, things that would be completely unremarkable if you found them in any other context. It is only when you look at what surrounds them, what they reference, what they were filed next to, what came out at the same time versus what didn't, that they start to mean something. The Manhattan Project records have been coming out in waves since the late 1940s. Each wave has added something. Each wave has also, in its own way, revealed a new set of edges, new places where the record stops and you can see the outline of something that is not there. I want to start with a specific moment. Not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is illustrative of how this process actually works. In 1993, President Clinton signed an executive order establishing the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. The committee was created specifically to investigate experiments conducted on human subjects during the Cold War era involving radiation. And as part of that investigation, researchers began pulling records from the Atomic Energy Commission, from the Department of Defense, from the Department of Energy records that had been sitting in various classified or restricted collections for decades. What they found was not a single revelation. It was more like a texture, a consistent pattern of documents that had been handled differently from surrounding records, withheld longer, classified at higher levels, routed through different review processes. Some of them had been declassified at some point, but then effectively buried, technically available but not indexed, not referenced in finding aids, not connected to the broader record in any way that would help a researcher find them. That last technique has a name in archival and intelligence circles. It is sometimes called declassification by obscurity. The document exists. It is technically accessible. But if no one knows it exists, and it is not connected to anything that would lead someone to look for it, it might as well be classified. It sits on a shelf and waits for someone to stumble across it. Some of the human radiation experiment documents were like that, and we will come back to those specifically in a later chapter because they deserve their own space. What matters here is what the 1993 investigation revealed about the record-keeping patterns more broadly. The committee's final report, which is publicly available, and which is genuinely worth reading if you have the patience for government prose, noted that record disposition across the relevant agencies was inconsistent in ways that were hard to explain purely by bureaucratic accident. Certain categories of records had been retained by agencies rather than transferred to the National Archives, contrary to standard federal record-keeping requirements. Other records had been destroyed under retention schedules that, upon review, seemed to have been applied selectively. And in some cases, records that should have existed based on references in other documents simply could not be located. The committee was careful in its language. It did not use the word cover-up. It used phrases like inadequate documentation practices and irregular retention patterns. That is the language of a formal government review, and it is chosen carefully. But if you read those phrases in the context of what the committee actually found, the specific documents, the specific gaps, the specific inconsistencies, the careful language starts to feel like a diplomatic wrapper around something less comfortable. Here is one specific thing worth sitting with. During the Manhattan Project and the early Atomic Energy Commission years, a particular classification category was used for certain documents. The category was not standard military classification, not the usual confidential, secret, top secret hierarchy. It was a separate designation specific to atomic energy information created under the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. The category was called restricted data. Restricted data had and still has, because it still legally exists, an unusual property. Unlike most classified information, restricted data does not automatically declassify over time. There is no sunset provision. A document classified as restricted data in 1947 remains restricted data indefinitely unless it is affirmatively reviewed and declassified by an authorized official. The classification does not expire. It just continues. This matters because it means that a significant portion of the Manhattan Project record has been sitting in a legal state of indefinite restriction for more than 70 years, not because anyone is actively reviewing it and deciding it needs to stay secret, but because the mechanism that would release it requires affirmative action, and affirmative action requires resources, and resources are not unlimited. The Department of Energy has a declassification program. It has declassified an enormous volume of material. But researchers who work in this space will tell you that the backlog, the volume of material that exists in restricted data status and has not yet been reviewed, is substantial. And in the meantime, those records are not accessible, not to historians, not to journalists, not to the families of people who worked in those facilities and want to understand what their parents or grandparents were exposed to. There is something quietly uncomfortable about a classification category that does not expire. It was created with a rationale. Nuclear weapons information is genuinely sensitive in ways that most other wartime secrets are not, because the weapons still exist and the information is still technically useful to someone who wants to build one. That rationale is real. But it also creates a structure where the default is permanent restriction, and the burden is on the system to actively choose openness rather than the other way around. And systems, especially large bureaucratic ones, tend not to actively choose anything unless someone is pushing. The pushing has come, over the years, from researchers and journalists and historians and advocacy groups, from FOIA requests, some of which have taken years to resolve, from congressional pressure, occasional and uneven. From moments like the 1993 radiation experiment investigation, which created a temporary institutional will to surface things that had been sitting quietly for a long time. But the pushing is not continuous. It is episodic. And in between episodes, the backlog grows, and the people who were there get older, and the tacit knowledge I mentioned in the last chapter continues its quiet disappearance. There is a researcher. I am going to describe her without naming her, because I am not certain of the precise details and I do not want to misrepresent someone's work, who spent several years in the 1990s and early 2000s working through Department of Energy archives related to the early nuclear program. She described the experience. In an interview I came across as navigating a library where half the catalog cards reference books that are not on the shelves, and no one can tell you whether the books were checked out or never arrived, or were shelved somewhere else under a different name. That description has stayed with me because it captures something that is hard to convey when you are just listing facts about classification categories and retention schedules. The experience of working in this archive is not like finding a hidden room. It is like walking through a very large, very serious, very well-maintained building and noticing, gradually, that certain doors are always locked, and that when you ask about them, the people you ask are not unfriendly, they are just uncertain. They do not always know what is behind the doors either. Some of those doors have opened since. A significant declassification effort in the mid-1990s released a large volume of material. The OpenNet database, maintained by the Department of Energy, contains hundreds of thousands of declassified documents. The Manhattan Project Heritage Preservation Association has worked to collect and preserve records that might otherwise have been dispersed or lost. So the story is not static. It has moved. Material has come out. Understanding has deepened. But the material that has come out has also, in some cases, raised new questions. Because when a document surfaces that references another document, when a memo says "see attached report," or as discussed in the enclosed analysis, and the attached report or the enclosed analysis is not in the same file, not in any adjacent file, not findable in any index, that absence is now visible in a way it wasn't before. The newly released document has created a new gap. That is how archival research often works. Every answer produces a new question. Every open door reveals another door. The question I keep coming back to, sitting with all of this, is whether the gaps are random or shaped. Whether they are distributed the way you would expect from ordinary bureaucratic entropy, evenly, roughly, across all categories, or whether certain topics, certain time periods, certain kinds of information are systematically less represented in what has survived and become accessible. I think the answer, based on what researchers have found over decades of work in this material, is that the gaps are not random. They cluster, and the clustering is not subtle once you know what to look for. We are going to look at where they cluster next. There are a few ways a document can disappear. The most obvious is destruction. Someone decides, or a policy decides, that a record no longer needs to be kept, and it is shredded or burned or deleted. This happens constantly in government, legally and routinely, under retention schedules that determine how long different categories of records must be preserved before they are eligible for disposal. It is not inherently sinister. Filing cabinets fill up. Storage costs money. Not every procurement log needs to exist forever. But destruction under a retention schedule is supposed to be documented. There is supposed to be a record of what was destroyed, when, under what authority. And in a program as historically significant as the Manhattan Project, the expectation, at least in retrospect, is that destruction would have been handled with particular care. Sometimes it was. Sometimes the documentation of what was destroyed is itself intact and findable, and you can look at it and see exactly what was disposed of and why. That is actually useful information, even though the underlying records are gone. but sometimes the documentation of destruction is also missing. And that is a different situation, because now you do not know whether the records were destroyed under a legitimate retention schedule, or destroyed outside of one, or transferred somewhere and misattributed, or simply lost in the ordinary chaos of a large institution managing an enormous volume of material. You are left with an absence that has no explanation attached to it. The clusters I mentioned at the end of the last section, the places where gaps appear more frequently than you would expect from random chance, tend to involve a few specific categories. And I want to go through them carefully, because I think each one tells a slightly different part of the story. The first cluster is around the health and safety records from the production facilities. Oak Ridge, Hanford, and the other production sites were working with radioactive materials at a scale and in conditions that had no real precedent. The science of radiation safety in the early 1940s was genuinely incomplete. The people designing the safety protocols were working from incomplete data, and in some cases from assumptions that turned out to be wrong. Exposure limits that were considered acceptable at the time have since been revised significantly. Some of the workers received doses that would not be permitted today. The records of those exposures, the dosimetry records, the health monitoring data, the medical files, are not entirely missing. Some of them survived and have been used in epidemiological studies that tried, decades later, to assess the long-term health effects on the workforce, but the coverage is uneven. Some sites have reasonably complete records for certain time periods and almost nothing for others. Some worker populations are well documented and others are nearly invisible in the record. The workers who are least visible tend to be the ones who were least visible at the time. Contract laborers. Workers brought in for specific construction phases and then released. People who worked at smaller satellite facilities rather than the main sites. And in a pattern that should not be surprising given the history of the period, African American workers, who were present at Oak Ridge and other sites in significant numbers, working in segregated conditions, are systematically underrepresented in the surviving health and exposure records. That underrepresentation has consequences that are not purely historical. There have been compensation programs established for workers who developed illnesses related to their nuclear weapons work. The Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Program is the main one. And the ability to receive compensation depends in part on being able to document exposure, which depends on records existing, which, for some of the workers least protected at the time, they do not. So the gap in the record is not just an archival problem. It is a living problem, or it was for the workers still alive when those compensation programs were established, and it is a problem for their families now. The second cluster of gaps is around the internal security and counterintelligence records. This one is somewhat expected, in the sense that intelligence records are typically among the most protected and most slowly declassified categories of government documents. But the specific pattern of what has and has not come out from Manhattan Project counterintelligence is interesting. The broad outlines of Soviet espionage within the project are known. The VENONA program, the signals intelligence effort that intercepted and decoded Soviet communications, produced a significant body of evidence about Soviet agents operating in the United States during the 1940s, and some of that evidence pointed directly at people with Manhattan Project access. The VENONA transcripts were declassified in the 1990s, and they are genuinely illuminating. But VENONA was not the only counterintelligence operation running during and after the project. The FBI maintained its own investigation, separate from military intelligence, and those records, the full FBI files on Manhattan Project security, have come out only partially. Some portions remain withheld. Others have been released, but with significant redactions that make it difficult to understand the full scope of what the Bureau was tracking. Military intelligence ran its own operations. The Army's Counterintelligence Corps was active at Manhattan Project sites throughout the war. Their records exist, some of them, in the National Archives, but the finding aids describe gaps, time periods with thin documentation, files that appear to have been weeded, a term archivists use for the selective removal of documents from a file before transfer. Who weeded them and why and what was removed is in most cases not documented. The third cluster, and this one is the quietest, the easiest to miss, is around the internal policy debates. Large programs generate internal disagreement. People argue about methods, priorities, timelines, resource allocation. Those arguments happen in memos and meeting minutes and letters, and they are usually part of the archival record because they are part of the ordinary business of running an institution. For the Manhattan Project, some of those internal debates are visible in the record. The arguments between scientists and military officials about how the project should be managed, the debates about sharing research with the British, the discussions about post-war policy, but there are areas where the record of internal debate is thin in a way that feels disproportionate. The discussions around targeting, which cities, which criteria, who was in those conversations, are documented, but not completely. Some of the meetings that historians believe took place, based on references in other documents, do not have corresponding minutes or records. The decision-making process for the most consequential choice of the project has gaps in its paper trail. That is worth sitting with, not because it proves anything, but because the decision to use the bomb against civilian populations was the central moral question of the project, and the record of how that decision was made, and who said what in the process is incomplete in ways that make it difficult to fully reconstruct. Maybe those gaps are innocent. Maybe notes were not taken. Maybe conversations happened informally, without documentation. That is plausible. Plausible is not the same as satisfying. There is one more thing I want to mention before we move on, and it is something that came out not through formal declassification, but through what might be described as an administrative accident. In the late 1980s, a historian working at a regional federal records repository in the Pacific Northwest came across a set of boxes that were not properly indexed. They had been transferred from a Department of Energy predecessor agency and had sat in storage for years without being cataloged. When the historian opened them, he found a collection of records from the Hanford site covering a period in the late 1940s, after the Manhattan Project had formally ended, but while the facility was still operating under the new Atomic Energy Commission. The records included internal reports on environmental monitoring, specifically monitoring of radiation releases into the Columbia River and the surrounding air. The reports showed that releases had occurred, some of them significant, and that they had been tracked internally. They also showed that the public information about those releases, what was being said to local communities, what was being reported to oversight bodies, did not fully correspond to what the internal monitoring data showed. This was not entirely surprising to researchers who had been following Hanford's history. There had been allegations along these lines for years, but here was documentation, internal documentation, sitting in uncatalogued boxes found more or less by chance. The historian reported the find. The records were eventually processed and made accessible. And they became part of a larger reckoning with Hanford's environmental history that is still, in various ways, ongoing. The thing that stays with me about that story is not the content of the records, though the content matters. It is the mechanism of discovery, chance. In an uncatalogued box in a regional repository, a historian who happened to be looking in that particular place. How many boxes are there that no one has happened to look in yet? That is not a rhetorical question. I genuinely do not know the answer. And I am not sure anyone does. There is a petition that gets mentioned sometimes when people tell the story of the Manhattan Project. It was written in July 1945, about a month before Hiroshima, by a group of scientists working at the University of Chicago's Metallurgical Laboratory, one of the research sites connected to the larger project. The petition was addressed to President Truman. It urged him not to use the atomic bomb against Japan without warning, without a demonstration of its power that might allow for surrender before civilian casualties. The petition was signed by 70 scientists. Leo Szilard, a physicist who had been instrumental in initiating the American nuclear program, drafted it. He circulated it quietly, carefully, among colleagues who he thought might be sympathetic. Not everyone who read it signed. Some agreed with the sentiment but thought it was inappropriate to question military decisions. Some thought it would be ineffective. Some thought it might endanger their positions. The petition was forwarded up the chain of command. It never reached Truman. General Groves saw to that. It was intercepted, filed, and effectively set aside. The president was not informed that scientists working on the weapon had expressed moral objections to its use. That part of the story is known. The petition exists. It was declassified years ago. You can read it now in archives and in published collections of Manhattan Project documents. What is less visible, what takes more work to piece together, is what happened to the people who signed it, not immediately, not dramatically, but over time, because the thing about internal dissent in a program like this is that it gets noticed. And noticed does not always mean punished. Sometimes it just means remembered, noted, recorded somewhere in a file that follows a person through the rest of their career. Security files from the Manhattan Project era are among the most incomplete parts of the record. Personnel security files, the files kept on individuals who had clearances, who were being monitored, who were flagged for one reason or another, were maintained separately from general personnel records. They were classified at higher levels. And many of them, after the project ended, were either retained by intelligence agencies rather than transferred to the National Archives, or they were destroyed under policies that applied specifically to security and intelligence records. What survives is fragmentary. Some names appear in indexes or finding aids with notations like security file, retained by agency or disposition unknown. Others are simply absent. You know someone worked on the project. Their name appears in scientific papers, in lab reports, in other documentation, but their security file, if one existed, is not locatable. For the scientists who signed Shillard's petition, the records are uneven. Some of them went on to long, successful careers. Some of them were later involved in efforts to control nuclear weapons, to establish international oversight, to advocate for arms reduction. And some of them found that career opportunities that might have been available to them, academic positions, government advisory roles, continued security clearances, became harder to obtain after the war. It is difficult to draw direct lines. Causation in career trajectories is complicated. People move for all sorts of reasons. Opportunities fall through for all sorts of reasons. But when you look at the pattern, when you look at how scientists who were vocal in their opposition to the bomb's use were treated in the decade after the war, compared to scientists who were not, a shape starts to emerge, not a purge, nothing that organized. Just a consistent low-level friction, clearances that took longer to renew, advisory positions that went to other people, grants that were not approved. The kind of thing that is hard to prove was deliberate, but that accumulates. There is a physicist named Joseph Rotblat who is worth mentioning here. He is not American, he was Polish, worked in Britain, but he was part of the Manhattan Project. He worked at Los Alamos for a time, and in late 1944 he left. He was one of the only scientists who voluntarily walked away from the project before it was finished. He left because he had come to believe that the bomb was no longer justified. The original rationale had been to build it before Germany did. By late 1944, it was clear that Germany was not going to build one. The war in Europe was winding down. And Rotblat felt that continuing to develop a weapon that would be used against Japan, a country that did not have a nuclear program, was a step he could not participate in. He requested to leave. His request was granted, but not without complications. He was interrogated about his reasons. His motives were questioned. There was suspicion that his departure was politically motivated, that he might be sympathetic to the Soviet Union, that he might be a security risk. He was not. He was simply a man whose conscience had caught up with his work. After the war, Rotblat became a prominent advocate for nuclear disarmament. He co-founded the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, an organization dedicated to reducing the danger of armed conflict. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995. His later life was devoted entirely to trying to undo, or at least contain, what he had helped create. But for years after he left Los Alamos, he was watched. British intelligence kept a file on him. American intelligence noted his associations. His name appeared in communications between agencies, flagged as someone whose political views warranted monitoring. Those files have come out, some of them, through declassification efforts in the UK and the US. They are not dramatic, they are bureaucratic. They show an ordinary institutional reflex. Once someone is noted as a potential concern, that notation persists. It gets copied forward. It gets referenced in new contexts. Rotblat was never charged with anything, never accused of espionage, never subjected to any formal proceeding. He was just watched. For a long time, and that is a pattern that shows up again and again in the post-Manhattan Project period. Scientists who expressed moral or political concerns about nuclear weapons were categorized, informally but consistently, as risks. Not security risks in the sense of being spies, political risks. People whose continued influence might complicate the trajectory of the nuclear program. The institutional logic was not irrational. If you are running a program to build more and better nuclear weapons, which is what the Atomic Energy Commission and later the Department of Defense were doing throughout the Cold War, then people who publicly argue that nuclear weapons are immoral or destabilizing are in fact working against your program's goals. They are obstacles, and institutions deal with obstacles. They do not always deal with them violently or even visibly. Sometimes they just root around them, exclude them from meetings, pass over them for positions. Make it harder for them to access the levers of influence they might otherwise have had. The records of how that exclusion happened are, predictably, thin, because it is not the kind of thing that generates official documentation. There is rarely a memo that says do not hire this person because they signed a petition. It happens informally. It happens in conversations that are not recorded. It happens when someone's name comes up for a position and someone else in the room says, quietly, I am not sure they are the right fit, and the conversation moves on. But sometimes there are traces, letters of recommendation that were requested but never sent. Grant applications that were reviewed unfavorably without clear justification. Security clearances that were delayed or revoked on grounds that were vague or procedural. One of the more visible cases, visible because it became a public proceeding, was the case of J. Robert Oppenheimer. We are going to spend a whole chapter on him later because his story is large and complicated and has layers that go beyond what we are talking about now. But in the context of scientists who question the direction of the nuclear program, Oppenheimer is the most documented example. After the war, Oppenheimer opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb. He did not oppose it secretly. He opposed it in his role as chair of the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission in a formal report that laid out his reasoning. He believed the hydrogen bomb was unnecessary, destabilizing, and morally indefensible. Other scientists on the committee agreed with him. They wrote that opinion into the official record. The hydrogen bomb was developed anyway. And a few years later, Oppenheimer's security clearance was revoked in a proceeding that ostensibly focused on his past associations and his honesty in disclosing them. But people who have studied that hearing, and the record of it is extensive, though parts of it were classified for years, generally agree that the real issue was not his past. It was his opposition to the hydrogen bomb. It was his influence. It was the fact that he had used his position to argue against the direction the weapons program was taking, and that his arguments carried weight. The hearing was, in effect, a mechanism to remove that influence, and it worked. Oppenheimer was stripped of his clearance. He continued to work as a physicist, as an academic, but his role as an advisor to the government on nuclear policy was over. The files from that hearing, the transcripts, the exhibits, the security dossier compiled on Oppenheimer over many years, were classified for a long time. When they were finally released, they revealed the extent to which Oppenheimer had been under surveillance. His phone had been tapped, his conversations had been recorded, his associations had been mapped in detail. All of this was legal, more or less, under the security framework of the time. But legal is not the same as proportionate, and the level of scrutiny applied to Oppenheimer and to other scientists who questioned weapons policy was not applied evenly. It was targeted, and the targeting had a purpose. The purpose was not to uncover espionage, it was to manage dissent. Silence has a weight. For the scientists who stayed silent after their questions went unanswered, that weight became part of their daily lives. For those who tried to speak out later, the weight pressed down on everything they could say. They knew the rules had changed. The program had become larger than the bomb itself. The Cold War had arrived, and with it came new demands, new fears, and a new kind of loyalty test. Being a scientist in that environment meant navigating a minefield of implications. An opinion published in a magazine could be treated as a statement on military capability. A friendship with a foreign national could be treated as a conduit for information. Even a simple curiosity about what else might be happening in the world carried risk. This was not just paranoia. It was the reality of the bureaucracy, and because it was bureaucratic, it was often invisible. There were no grand tribunals for most of them, no dramatic scenes in courtrooms, just letters that did not come, promises that were not fulfilled, requests that were never answered. The mechanism was designed to make failure seem like coincidence. A funding application denied for reasons unrelated to security, a conference invitation extended to someone else, a recommendation letter returned unopened. Over time, these small refusals accumulate into a pattern. And over time, the people experiencing that pattern begin to wonder whether the refusals are personal or systemic, or something else entirely. In some cases, they are all three. The problem of knowing what to believe in the face of this kind of treatment is compounded by the lack of documentation. We mentioned the security files earlier, the ones that are missing or incomplete, but beyond the official files, there is the question of personal correspondence, diaries, private letters. Notes scribbled on the backs of envelopes. These things were not supposed to exist for a reason. If they survived, it was luck. There are archives that contain some of this material now. Letters written between friends, journals kept in secret. They offer glimpses into what people were thinking when they felt safest to think honestly. But even these fragments tell us more about what cannot be known than what can be revealed, because much of it was destroyed, some of it by design, some of it by neglect. I find myself thinking about a letter that appeared in a collection recently. It was written by a physicist who had worked at Los Alamos during the war. He wrote to his brother, describing a conversation he had had with General Groves. The letter describes the general asking him directly whether he understood the responsibility of what they had built. The physicist wrote that he felt the question was not about understanding. It was about control. The letter ends without a conclusion, just a description of the room they were sitting in. The dust motes floating in the light from the window, the sound of rain outside, and then nothing, no further explanation, no date, no signature, just the fragment of a conversation that lasted perhaps 20 minutes. It is impossible to know where the letter came from originally. The collection it appeared in was donated by a descendant years later, and the provenance trail is not fully documented, which means this object, this piece of evidence, exists in a state of uncertainty similar to the project itself. We want to trust it. We want to know its context. But we can only have the piece we hold in our hands. That fragility is characteristic of the historical record here. Things that matter are the hardest to preserve, because they are the things people tried hardest to hide, or forget, or burn. For the scientists who left the project, or were forced out, there is a final silence that belongs to them alone. When they died, their private papers were sometimes sorted by family members who did not understand what was important. Boxes were thrown away. Letters were shredded. Not maliciously, just accidentally. The result is that we may never know certain truths about their inner lives. We will never know which fears haunted them the most. We will never know who they blamed for what, and whether they ever forgave themselves. That absence sits with the rest of the archive, like the missing health records, like the lost security files. It is part of the texture of what we have. It makes the story harder to tell with certainty, but also paradoxically more honest, because life is rarely neat. History is messy. The truth is often a collection of partial memories rather than a single coherent narrative. As we move past the internal dynamics of the Manhattan Project, as we leave the labs and the hearings and the private offices, the focus shifts. From the people inside the secret to the place that held them there, from the mines to the ground, to the cities that were built to hide cities, there is a town that existed off the map. People lived there, worked there, raised children there. They thought they knew the shape of their world, but they did not. They were walking through a factory the size of a landscape, producing power that could erase entire maps. We have been talking about the decisions made by committees and individuals. Now we need to talk about the experience of living inside the decision, of working on the conveyor belt of a weapon that would change the century. It is a different kind of silence, less philosophical, more immediate. Less about policy and more about the everyday mechanics of hiding in plain sight. You wake up. You take a bus to a site that has no sign on it. You go to a building that has no name. You do whatever your job requires. You go home. You look at your neighbors. You wonder what they do. You worry they might know what you do. You learn to keep a certain distance. You learn to listen more than speak. That kind of life leaves a mark, even on the records, especially on the records. But before we walk into that town, let me sit with one more thing about the scientists for a moment, the ones who were left behind, the ones who finished their work and moved on. Some of them wrote memoirs later, some gave interviews. A few refused to speak at all. The stories they told were not always the same. Sometimes they disagreed with each other. Sometimes they contradicted what the official record said. And sometimes, decades later, they would find a document that changed how they remembered the whole thing. A paper that surfaced in an archive that they had never seen before, a number that didn't add up, a date that was wrong, and suddenly their own life, their own memory would feel less solid, not because they had lied, but because the official story they had grown up with had turned out to be incomplete. It is difficult to live with that, to realize that your own participation in history was recorded by people who did not intend to tell the whole story. I imagine a man in his 70s or 80s sitting in a quiet room reading a declassified memo that references his own work. He recognizes the handwriting. He recognizes the date, but he does not recognize the context. The memo implies something about his role that he does not remember saying or doing. He puts the paper down. He closes the file. He walks out onto his porch and looks at the sky. It does not matter, technically. The war is over. The bomb has been used. The Cold War continues regardless, but for the person sitting on that porch, the question remains, what actually happened, and who gets to decide the answer? This is the foundation we stand on as we prepare to visit the places where the work got done. Where the secrets were kept not in files, but in walls, in fences, in silence. Sometimes I try to imagine what it would feel like to live somewhere that is not on a map, not a remote cabin in the woods, not a tiny village no one has heard of. A place with 75,000 people in it. A place with neighborhoods and grocery stores and a high school and a movie theater. A place that functions in every practical sense like a small American city, except that if you looked at any published map of Tennessee in 1944, it was not there. Oak Ridge was built starting in 1942 on roughly 60,000 acres of land in the eastern part of the state. The land was acquired through eminent domain, which meant that the people who had been living there, farming families, small communities, some of them with roots going back generations, were told to leave, given a few weeks in some cases, compensated technically, though the amounts were often disputed. And then their homes and churches and fields were absorbed into something they would not learn the nature of for years. What went up in their place was a city, not a camp, not a facility, not a temporary arrangement. A city built fast and built large, designed to house the workforce needed for the uranium enrichment operations that would produce the fissile material for the bomb. The speed of it is hard to absorb. Within a year, the population of Oak Ridge had exceeded that of most established cities in Tennessee. Within 2 years, it was the 5th largest city in the state. It had its own bus system, its own fire department, its own schools, its own hospital, its own recreation facilities. It was surrounded by fences and guarded by armed checkpoints. You could not enter without a pass. You could not leave without a pass. And if you lived there, you could not tell anyone outside where you were or what you were doing. The workers called it the secret city. Not officially, that was just what people said. Here is something I think about. The people inside Oak Ridge were, in a very real sense, living in 2 realities at once. Their daily lives were ordinary. They went to work. They came home. They raised children. They attended church. They played softball. The routines of American life reproduced faithfully behind a fence. But the context for all of that ordinariness was extraordinary, and they were not allowed to acknowledge the context. They could live in the town, but not speak the town's true name. They could do their jobs, but not understand their jobs. They existed in a space that was physically real, but officially invisible. I have read accounts from people who grew up in Oak Ridge as children. Their memories are a strange mix of the mundane and the surreal. One woman described learning to ride a bicycle on streets that did not appear on any map. Another remembered the gates, the guards, the badges, and how as a child she simply assumed that all towns worked this way, that everywhere had fences, that everyone's father went to work in a building he could not describe. Children normalize whatever they grow up in. That is one of the things children do. And the children of Oak Ridge normalized secrecy the way other children normalize weather. The workforce at Oak Ridge was enormous and stratified. At the top were the scientists and engineers who understood, at least partially, what they were building. Below them were technicians, operators, maintenance workers, administrative staff, construction workers, people who performed specific tasks within specific compartments, and who were given only the information necessary to do their particular job. A woman operating a calyotron, one of the electromagnetic separation devices used to enrich uranium, might spend her entire shift adjusting dials and monitoring readings without knowing what was passing through the machine she was operating. That is not an exaggeration. It is documented. There are oral histories from calyotron operators who describe being told to keep a needle in a certain range on a dial, and that was it. That was the whole instruction. Keep the needle here. If it drifts, adjust. Do not ask what you are adjusting or why. After the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, many of these workers learned for the first time what they had been making. Some of them described the revelation as a shock. Others said they had suspected something large was happening, that the secrecy itself was a kind of signal, and that the announcement confirmed what they had already felt in some inarticulate way. A few said they felt proud. A few said they felt sick. Most described something more complicated than either of those, something that did not resolve neatly into a single emotion. The record keeping at Oak Ridge reflected the compartmentalized structure of the work itself. Each facility within the complex maintained its own records, more or less independently. The Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant had its records. The K-25 gaseous diffusion plant had its records. The X-10 graphite reactor, which was a pilot facility for the plutonium production that would later scale up at Hanford, had its records. Personnel records, operational logs, safety reports, production data, maintenance documentation. Each category was handled according to its own classification level and its own retention policy. And across all of those categories, the same structural problem applied. The people generating the records often did not fully understand what the records described. A technician recording instrument readings was recording numbers. The context for those numbers, what they meant in terms of uranium enrichment levels, or radiation exposure, or process efficiency, was held by someone else, someone at a higher clearance level, someone in a different compartment. So the records that survive from the operational level at Oak Ridge are in many cases technically precise but contextually empty. They tell you what happened in a narrow, mechanical sense. They do not tell you what it meant. The meaning was carried elsewhere, in documents that were classified differently, stored differently, and in some cases handled under different retention rules. When you try to reconstruct the full picture from these partial records, when you try to marry the operational data from the factory floor with the scientific data, from the research divisions with the health data, from the medical offices, with the security data from the counterintelligence units, you find that the pieces do not always fit together the way you would expect. Not because anyone was necessarily falsifying records, but because the records were generated in isolation from each other by people with different levels of understanding, under different classification regimes, and they were never designed to be reassembled. The compartmentalization that made the secret possible also made the record inherently fragmented. That is not a later corruption of the archive. It is baked in. It is the original condition. And it means that certain questions about what happened at Oak Ridge, questions about worker exposure, about environmental releases, about the efficiency and safety of the production processes, are genuinely difficult to answer from the surviving documentation, not because the answers are hidden, but because the records that would provide a complete answer were distributed across compartments that were never meant to talk to each other, and some of those compartments have lost parts of their records in the decades since. There is a particular gap that researchers have noted, and it has to do with the early period of construction and operation at Oak Ridge, roughly 1943 to early 1945. During that phase, the facilities were being built and brought online simultaneously. Construction workers and operational workers were often on the same site. Safety protocols were being developed in real time, and the documentation from that period is thinner than from later periods, when operations had stabilized and record-keeping routines had been established. That thinness matters because the early period was also, by most accounts, the period of highest risk. Processes were new, exposures were less well controlled, equipment was being tested for the first time. If there were incidents, spills, releases, exposures beyond expected levels, they would have been most likely during this phase, and the records from this phase are the least complete. Maybe that is coincidence. Construction phases are chaotic. Record keeping during construction is always less organized than during stable operations. That is true across industries and across history. There is nothing inherently suspicious about it. But it does mean that the period we would most like to understand, the period when things were most likely to go wrong, when workers were most likely to be at risk, is the period we know least about. And the people who worked during that period are almost all gone now. The tacit knowledge problem again. The things they saw and experienced and could have told us, given the chance, are no longer available. Oak Ridge is a real place today. You can visit it. The town was incorporated as a public city in 1959 when the gates came down and civilians were allowed to enter freely for the first time. It has a population now of around 30,000. It has museums. It has historical markers. It is part of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, which was established in 2015. There is something almost poignant about that. A town that was built to be invisible is now a national park. A place that could not be found on any map now has signs pointing to it from the highway, but the records from the years of invisibility are still, in some ways, invisible themselves. Not all of them. Much has been preserved and made accessible. Serious archival and historical work has been done, but the gaps remain, and the people who could fill them are gone. And the structure that created those gaps, the compartmentalization, the classification, the intentional fragmentation of knowledge was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. I mentioned segregation earlier, briefly, and I want to come back to it now, because it is one of the parts of the Oak Ridge story that tends to get compressed into a sentence or two in most accounts, and it deserves more than that. Oak Ridge was built in the American South in the 1940s. It was built by the federal government, and it was built segregated. Black workers were recruited for the project in significant numbers, primarily for construction and manual labor roles. They lived in a separate area of the town, a section called the Hutments. The name itself tells you something. While white workers and their families were housed in prefabricated houses, dorms, and apartments, many black workers were assigned to plywood huts, small, uninsulated, arranged in rows, shared bathrooms, shared laundry facilities, conditions that were markedly worse than what was available to white workers at comparable job levels. This was not hidden at the time. It was policy. It was consistent with the broader pattern of racial segregation in the military and in federal facilities during that era. The Army ran Oak Ridge, and the Army was segregated, and Oak Ridge reflected that. But here is the part that connects to the broader story we are telling about records and gaps. The documentation of conditions in the Hutments, the health records, the safety records, the environmental monitoring data for those specific areas is substantially thinner than for the main residential sections of Oak Ridge. The workers who lived in the Hutments were less likely to appear in medical records with the same level of detail as white workers. Their job assignments were less precisely documented. Their exposure histories, in many cases, are essentially unrecoverable. This is not unique to Oak Ridge. It is a pattern that shows up across the history of American industrial and military programs involving segregated workforces. The people who were treated as less important at the time were documented as less important at the time. And the record reflects that hierarchy with a fidelity that is, in its own way, brutally honest. There was a black newspaper, the Chicago Defender, that tried to report on conditions at Oak Ridge during the war. They were not allowed access. Their requests were denied on security grounds, and that security rationale was technically valid. No press of any kind was allowed inside the gates. But the effect was that the specific conditions experienced by black workers at Oak Ridge were not publicly reported during the period when public reporting might have created pressure for change. After the war, some of those conditions were documented through oral history projects and through the work of historians who specifically sought out the stories of black Oak Ridge workers. That work is valuable. But it came decades after the fact, and it relies on memory rather than contemporary records, because the contemporary records are sparse. I bring this up not to shift the story away from the broader question of missing records. I bring it up because it illustrates something important about the way gaps in the record are not neutral. They have a pattern, and the pattern tends to map onto existing structures of power and inequality. The people who had the least power at the time are the people whose experiences are least documented, which means they are the people whose stories are hardest to recover now. That is true of the black workers at Oak Ridge. It is true of the contract laborers at Hanford. It is true of the communities near the Trinity test site, which we will get to later. The record is thinnest where the people were most vulnerable. Let me shift now to something slightly different. The question of what the workers at Oak Ridge knew, and when they knew it, and what they were told versus what they figured out on their own. The official policy was total compartmentalization. You knew your job. You did not know anyone else's job. You did not know the larger purpose. You followed procedures and you did not ask questions. But people are not actually like that. People talk. People observe. People piece things together. And in a town of 75,000 people living behind a fence, working in enormous industrial facilities that consumed staggering amounts of electricity, people formed impressions. They had theories. They speculated quietly about what the whole operation was for. Some of those speculations are recorded in oral histories taken years later. One common theory among workers was that they were manufacturing something for the Navy. Another was that it had something to do with Roosevelt's health. This one is strange and hard to trace, but it shows up in more than one account. A few workers guessed something closer to the truth, that it involved a new kind of weapon, though the specifics were beyond what anyone at the operational level could have reasoned out. The point is that compartmentalization was not total in practice. It was total in policy. In reality, there was leakage, not security breaches in the formal sense, not information passing to adversaries, but the ordinary human process of inference and gossip operating inside a system that was designed to prevent exactly that. The security apparatus at Oak Ridge was aware of this. They monitored it. There were security officers whose job was specifically to gauge how much the workforce had figured out and to intervene if speculation got too close to the truth. The details of how that monitoring worked are partially documented, but here again, the records are uneven. The day-to-day reports from security officers, what they heard, what they reported, what they recommended, exist for some periods and are absent for others. One thing that is documented is the billboard campaign. Signs posted around Oak Ridge with messages like what you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. The phrasing is folksy, almost friendly. It does not sound like a threat. It sounds like advice. But behind the friendly phrasing was a system of enforcement that included the possibility of dismissal, prosecution under wartime security statutes, and in some cases, investigation by military intelligence. Most workers complied. The few who did not, who talked too freely, who were overheard saying things that triggered concern, were typically removed from the site. Not always dramatically. Sometimes they were simply transferred to a non-sensitive position or told that their services were no longer needed. The paperwork, when it existed, usually cited vague administrative reasons. This is another area where the record gets thin, because disciplinary actions taken for security reasons were often handled outside the normal personnel system. They were processed through security channels, documented in security files, and those files, as I mentioned earlier, were maintained separately and have survived inconsistently. There is a broader point here that I keep circling back to. Oak Ridge was, in many ways, a rehearsal. Not for the bomb was being built in real time, a rehearsal for something else, for a way of organizing society around a secret, for a way of managing a large population inside a framework of controlled information. The techniques developed at Oak Ridge, compartmentalization, ambient surveillance, controlled communication, the management of rumors, the calibration of how much people were allowed to know, these were not entirely new. Military secrecy existed before the Manhattan Project. But the scale at which they were applied at Oak Ridge was new, and the lessons learned there were carried forward into the Cold War national security apparatus. When the Atomic Energy Commission took over from the Manhattan Project in 1947, it inherited not just the facilities and the personnel, but the institutional culture. The way things were done at Oak Ridge, the assumption that information should flow upward but not downward. The belief that security was best maintained through ignorance, the practice of separating workers from the meaning of their own work, became part of the operational DNA of the American nuclear establishment, and the record-keeping habits that went with that culture were carried forward too. The compartmentalization of records, the separate handling of security files, the retention policies that treated certain categories of information as permanently sensitive, the tendency to err on the side of restriction rather than access. So when researchers today encounter gaps in the Manhattan Project record, when they find files that are incomplete, or records that were destroyed under unclear authority, or documents that are referenced in other documents but cannot be located, they are encountering the legacy of a system that was designed from the beginning to fragment information. To ensure that no single person or single record contained the whole picture, that design served its purpose during the war. It kept the secret. Whether it has served history well is a different question. I want to mention one more thing before we leave Oak Ridge. After the war, after the gates came down, after the town became public, and the secrecy was no longer the defining feature of daily life, some of the former workers began to talk, slowly, in interviews, in memoirs, in conversations with their children and grandchildren. And some of what they said contradicted the official record in small but persistent ways. Not about the science. The science was well documented by then. What they contradicted was the narrative of safety and order. Workers described incidents that were not in the official reports. Spills that were cleaned up without paperwork. Equipment malfunctions that were fixed informally. Exposures that were noticed at the time but not recorded. Not because anyone was engaged in a cover-up, but because the culture of the workplace did not encourage documentation of problems. Problems were fixed and moved past. The priority was production, and production was framed as a matter of national survival. These are anecdotal accounts. They cannot be independently verified in most cases because the documentation that would verify them does not exist. And that is exactly the problem. The absence of documentation is used, sometimes, as evidence that the incidents did not occur. But the workers who were there say they did, and the workers who were there are the ones who would know. There is no clean resolution to that tension. The record says one thing. The people say another, and the record in this case is the product of a system that was specifically designed to limit what got recorded. I do not know how to resolve that. I am not sure anyone can, but I think it is worth sitting with. The idea that a record can be accurate as far as it goes and still fundamentally incomplete, that what was written down can be true and what was left out can also be true, and that the gap between those two truths is where a lot of the real history lives. It is getting late. Oak Ridge is quiet now, has been for decades in a way. The reactors still operate, some of them. The National Laboratory is still there, doing research that has nothing to do with weapons mostly. The town has neighborhoods and schools and people who have lived there their whole lives. But underneath the ordinary surface, if you know where to look, you can still see the seams. The places where the secret city shows through. The grid pattern of the streets that were laid out by army engineers in a hurry. The concrete foundations of buildings that no longer exist. The records that stop and start in ways that do not quite make sense unless you understand the system that produced them. The seams are part of the town now. They are part of the record, and they are part of this story. You hear a phrase like human radiation experiments, and your mind goes somewhere specific. Somewhere dark, probably. Somewhere that sounds like it belongs in a different kind of story, a horror story, a dystopian fiction, something with a villain and a motive you can point to and say, there, that is the evil part. But the real history is not like that. It is worse in some ways and more mundane in others. There are no villains in lab coats rubbing their hands together. There are memos. There are protocols. There are discussions among reasonable-sounding people about acceptable risk and scientific necessity and the needs of national defense. The language is calm. The tone is institutional, and the things being described in that calm institutional language are, in some cases, deeply troubling. I want to be careful with this chapter. Not because the facts are uncertain. Many of them are well documented now, thanks to the work of investigative journalists, congressional investigations, and the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments that I mentioned earlier. But because the temptation when discussing this material is to lean into outrage, and outrage, while understandable, can flatten things, it can make a complicated history feel simpler than it was, and this history is not simple, so let me start with what we know. During and after the Manhattan Project, experiments were conducted on human subjects involving exposure to radioactive materials. Some of these experiments were directly connected to the weapons program. Others were connected to broader research into the biological effects of radiation, research that was considered essential for protecting workers, soldiers, and eventually civilian populations in a world where nuclear weapons existed. The subjects of these experiments included hospital patients, prisoners, soldiers, and in some cases, people who did not fall neatly into any of those categories. The degree of consent they gave, the degree to which they understood what was being done to them, and why, varied enormously. In some cases, informed consent was obtained in something resembling the modern sense, though the standards of the time were different from what we would expect today. In other cases, consent was not obtained at all. One of the earliest and most well-known series of experiments involved the injection of plutonium into hospital patients. This began in 1945, while the Manhattan Project was still underway. The purpose was to understand how the human body processed plutonium, how it was absorbed, distributed, and excreted, because workers at the production facilities were being exposed to it, and the scientists needed data on what that exposure meant biologically. 18 patients were injected with plutonium between 1945 and 1947. They were at hospitals in Rochester, Chicago, Oak Ridge and San Francisco. Some of them were terminally ill. Some were not. Some were told they were receiving a treatment. Some were told very little. The amounts injected were small by industrial standards, but significant by any biological measure. The patients were not volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were selected by researchers, often because they were already hospitalized and accessible. Their medical conditions made them convenient subjects, either because their illnesses provided a cover for the injection, or because their prognosis was poor enough that the researchers judged the additional risk to be acceptable. That judgment, acceptable risk, is where the ethical questions begin. And they do not end neatly. The plutonium injection experiments were not public knowledge during the Manhattan Project or for decades afterward. The results were classified. The identities of the patients were coded. The research was published in restricted reports that circulated within the nuclear establishment, but were not available to the broader scientific or medical community. When the experiments first came to public attention through the work of journalist Eileen Wellsome, who published a series of articles in the Albuquerque Tribune in 1993, the reaction was significant. Wellsome had spent years tracking down the identities of the patients, piecing together medical records and institutional files that had been scattered across multiple archives. She identified the patients by name. She found their families. She told their stories. The articles led directly to the creation of the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments by the Clinton administration. The committee spent 2 years investigating, reviewed hundreds of thousands of documents, conducted public hearings, and produced a final report in 1995 that remains the most comprehensive accounting of these experiments. But the committee's work also revealed the limits of the record, because here is the thing about the plutonium injections. They are the most documented, most studied, most publicly discussed of the human radiation experiments. They are the cases where the record is most complete. And even in those cases, the record has gaps. For some of the 18 patients, the committee was able to reconstruct a reasonably complete picture of what happened, who authorized the injection, what the patient was told, what follow-up occurred, what the outcomes were. For others, the documentation was fragmentary. Authorization records were missing. Consent documentation, if it ever existed, could not be found. Follow-up data was incomplete or absent, and the plutonium injections were not the only experiments. The committee documented a much larger universe of radiation research involving human subjects during the Cold War period. Experiments involving the exposure of prisoners to testicular irradiation. Experiments involving the feeding of radioactive materials to institutionalized children. Experiments involving the exposure of soldiers to nuclear detonations during atmospheric tests. Experiments involving the release of radioactive materials into the environment to study dispersal patterns, with nearby communities serving as unwitting subjects. The scale of it is difficult to absorb all at once, and the documentation is wildly uneven. Some experiments are extensively documented, protocols, data, results, published reports. Others are known only through fragmentary references in other documents, a memo that mentions an experiment in passing, a budget line item that allocates funds for human subjects research at a particular facility. A reference in a scientist's correspondence to work that was being done, but that does not appear in any surviving research report. Those fragments are maddening for researchers. They suggest that the documented experiments may represent only a portion of what was actually conducted. Not because anyone has proven the existence of additional undocumented experiments. You cannot prove the existence of something for which no documentation survives. But because the fragments point outward, toward work that was referenced but never fully described, planned but never reported on, funded but never accounted for in the surviving record, the advisory committee addressed this directly in its report. They noted that the record was incomplete and that the incompleteness was not random. Certain categories of experiments were better documented than others. Experiments conducted at major research institutions with established record-keeping practices tended to leave fuller records than experiments conducted at military facilities or at smaller, less bureaucratically structured sites. Experiments that produced publishable results tended to leave records. Experiments that did not produce useful results or that produced results that were uncomfortable tended to leave fewer records. That last observation is worth pausing on. There is a natural selection effect in record keeping. Work that is successful gets written up. Work that is unsuccessful or embarrassing gets filed in a bottom drawer or discussed verbally rather than in writing, or simply not documented beyond the minimum necessary. This is true across all fields and all institutions. It is not evidence of conspiracy. It is evidence of human nature. But when the work in question involves exposing people to radiation without their informed consent, the ordinary dynamics of institutional record-keeping take on a different weight. Because the records that are most likely to be thin, the experiments that produced ambiguous results, or that involved complications, or that raised ethical questions even within the permissive standards of the time, are also the records that we would most want to see in full. I am not saying those records were deliberately destroyed. I do not know that. The advisory committee did not reach that conclusion either, though they noted that in some cases the absence of records was difficult to explain through ordinary attrition alone. What I am saying is that the structure of how records survive, what gets kept, what gets lost, what gets found is not neutral. It is shaped by the same institutional forces that shaped the experiments themselves. And those forces tended to favor documentation that reflected well on the institution and to disfavor documentation that did not. There is a specific case I want to describe, not because it is the worst, but because it illustrates the problem of partial records in a way that is hard to forget once you hear it. At the Fernald State School in Massachusetts, an institution for children with intellectual disabilities, researchers from MIT conducted experiments in the late 1940s and early 1950s involving the feeding of radioactive tracers to children. The tracers were mixed into breakfast cereal. The purpose was to study how the body absorbed certain minerals, with the radioactive component used as a tracking mechanism. The children were members of what the institution called a science club. Their parents had signed consent forms, but the consent forms did not mention radiation. They described the research in terms of nutritional studies. The parents were told their children would receive special diets. They were not told the diets included radioactive materials. The doses were low. The health risk, by current estimates, was small. The ethical violation was not primarily about physical harm. It was about deception, about using children who were institutionalized and vulnerable as research subjects without honest disclosure to the people responsible for them. The records of the Fernald experiments survived mostly because they were conducted through MIT and because MIT maintained its research files. When the experiments came to light in the 1990s, the records were available for review. The consent forms were found. The research protocols were found. The gap was not in the documentation of what was done. The gap was in the documentation of why anyone thought it was acceptable. The internal discussions, the ethical reasoning, the decision-making process that led to the design of the experiment, those are largely absent from the record. What survives is the mechanics. The rationale is missing. Maybe the rationale was never written down. Maybe it was discussed in a meeting and everyone in the room simply agreed and moved on. That is plausible. Ethical review processes, as we know them today, did not exist in the 1940s. Institutional review boards were not required. The idea that research on human subjects needed formal ethical justification, documented and reviewable, was not yet standard. So the absence of ethical documentation is not surprising, but it is revealing. It shows you a system in which certain questions were not asked, or were asked and answered informally, and in which the answers were not preserved. And when you look at that system from a distance of 70 years, the silence where the ethical reasoning should be feels louder than any document. There is a word that kept appearing in the advisory committee's report. The word is retrievable, as in, certain records were not retrievable. Not confirmed destroyed, not confirmed classified, just not retrievable. It is a precise word that communicates something imprecise. It means we looked and could not find it. It does not tell you why. And across the hundreds of pages of that report, the word appears often enough that it starts to feel less like an individual observation and more like a condition, a state of the archive itself. Large portions of the human radiation experiment record are simply in a state of non-retrievability, and whether that state is permanent or temporary, accidental or deliberate, depends on factors that the committee could not always determine. I want to talk about the soldiers. During the atmospheric nuclear weapons tests of the 1950s and early 1960s, tests conducted at the Nevada test site and in the Pacific, tens of thousands of military personnel were present. Some of them were there to observe. Some were there to participate in exercises designed to simulate combat conditions in a nuclear environment. They were positioned at various distances from the detonations. They were ordered to advance toward ground zero after the blast. They were exposed to fallout, to residual radiation, to the immediate effects of the detonation itself. These exercises had names: Operation Desert Rock, Operation Plumbob, Operation Upshot Knothole. They sound bureaucratic, which they were. They were planned and documented through military channels, with orders and after-action reports and the usual apparatus of military record-keeping. But the documentation of what the individual soldiers experienced, their radiation doses, their physical symptoms, their long-term health outcomes, is a different matter. Dosimetry during the atmospheric tests was inconsistent. Some soldiers wore film badges designed to measure radiation exposure. Some did not. Some badges were collected and read. Some were lost or damaged or never processed. The data that exists is incomplete, and the studies that have tried to use it to assess health effects have consistently noted that the dosimetry data is insufficient for firm conclusions. Which means that for a large number of soldiers who participated in nuclear tests, there is no reliable record of how much radiation they received. That gap has had direct, concrete consequences. Veterans who developed cancers or other illnesses potentially linked to radiation exposure have sought recognition and compensation through the Department of Veterans Affairs. The process requires documentation. You need to show that you were present at a specific test, at a specific distance, and that your exposure was above a certain threshold. And for many veterans, that documentation does not exist. Not because they were not there, their service records confirm they were, but because the exposure data was never recorded, or was recorded and lost, or was recorded in a form that cannot be meaningfully interpreted. The National Association of Atomic Veterans has advocated for decades on behalf of these soldiers. Their argument is straightforward. The government placed these men in proximity to nuclear detonations. The government failed to adequately monitor their exposure. The government should not then require documentation of exposure that the government itself failed to create. That argument has had some success. Legislation has been passed that eases the documentation burden for certain categories of atomic veterans, but the underlying problem remains. The record is incomplete, and the incompleteness falls, again, on the people who were most directly affected. There is something else about the military tests that I find difficult to sit with. It is the question of purpose. The stated purpose of placing soldiers near nuclear detonations was to study the psychological and operational effects of nuclear warfare on troops. The military wanted to know whether soldiers could function, could follow orders, could advance, could carry out missions in the aftermath of a nuclear explosion. This was considered essential information for military planning in an era when nuclear weapons were being integrated into battlefield strategy. That rationale is documented. It is in the planning papers for the test exercises. It is stated plainly, without apology, in the language of military necessity. But there is another dimension. The soldiers were, whether this was the primary purpose or not, also data points in a radiation exposure study. Their presence near the detonations generated biological data. Some of them were examined before and after. Blood samples were taken in some cases. Physical symptoms were noted. Follow-up studies were conducted, though inconsistently and not for all participants. The line between military exercise and human experiment is not always clear in these cases. The advisory committee wrestled with this question explicitly. Were the soldiers research subjects? They were not enrolled in a study in the formal sense. They were following orders. But the fact that data was collected from them, data that was used for research purposes, complicates the distinction, and the records reflect that ambiguity. The military records describe the exercises as training. The scientific records describe the same events as data collection opportunities. The two record sets do not always reference each other. They were maintained by different institutions under different classification regimes, and they have been declassified at different rates. Trying to match them up, trying to connect a specific soldier's military record with the scientific data collected from that soldier during a specific test, is, in practice, extremely difficult. The records were not designed to be matched. They were designed for different purposes by different bureaucracies, and the connections between them were never systematically documented. Let me shift to something that might be even harder to talk about, because it involves people who had even less agency than soldiers following orders. I mentioned prisoners earlier. There were experiments, documented, acknowledged experiments, in which prisoners at state and federal facilities were exposed to radiation as part of research programs funded by the Atomic Energy Commission and its successor agencies. At the Oregon State Prison and at the Washington State Prison, inmates were subjected to testicular irradiation experiments in the 1960s and 1970s. The purpose was to study the effects of radiation on reproductive function. The prisoners signed consent forms. They were compensated small amounts of money, trivial even by the standards of the time. The ethical problems with using prisoners as research subjects are well recognized today. Consent given in a prison environment is inherently compromised. The power differential between researchers and incarcerated subjects is too large for consent to be truly free. The financial incentive, however small, operates differently on someone who has no other source of income than on someone who does. These objections were not universally recognized at the time. The research was conducted openly within the institutions involved. It was reviewed, to some extent, by the institutional structures of the time. The records survive because the research was not considered secret. It was considered routine. What is harder to find in the record is any serious contemporaneous discussion of whether it should have been considered routine. The ethical debate that would later surround prisoner research is largely absent from the documentation of the period when the research was actually being conducted. It exists in retrospect. It exists in the Advisory Committee's report. It exists in the subsequent regulations that prohibited the use of prisoners as research subjects. But at the time, in the files that document the planning and execution of the experiments, the ethical dimension is a silence. And silence in a record is a strange thing. You cannot point to it and say, here, this is what is missing. You can only notice its absence by comparison, by knowing what should be there and seeing that it is not. I keep returning to the committee's report because it is the most thorough accounting we have. And one of its most striking findings was not about any single experiment, but about the institutional environment in which all of these experiments took place. The committee found that across the agencies involved, the AEC, the Department of Defense, the CIA, the Public Health Service, there was a consistent pattern of prioritizing research objectives over the rights and welfare of subjects. Not always, not universally. There were individuals within these agencies who raised concerns, who pushed for better safeguards, who argued for more transparency. But the institutional default was to prioritize the mission. And the mission, in the context of the Cold War, was understood as urgent enough to justify compromises that would not be tolerated in peacetime. The problem with that framing, mission urgency, justifying ethical compromise, is that it is self-reinforcing. Once you accept the premise that the mission is urgent enough, almost anything can be justified, and the documentation of that justification tends to take the form of absence rather than argument. People do not typically write memos explaining why they are cutting ethical corners. They just cut them and move on. The decision is embedded in the action, not in the record. So the records that survive show what was done. They do not, in most cases, show the reasoning that permitted it to be done. That reasoning was carried in the culture of the institution, in the shared assumptions of the people involved, in the informal understanding that certain things were acceptable because the stakes were high enough. When the stakes lowered, when the Cold War ended, when the immediate urgency faded, when the culture shifted, people looked back at what had been done and were troubled. But the institutional memory of why it had seemed acceptable at the time was already fading, and the records that might have preserved that memory were either thin or missing. There is a particular category of experiment that the advisory committee was never able to fully investigate. These were the experiments that they could identify only through indirect references. A budget allocation here, a mention in a letter there, a line in a report that says something like as demonstrated in the studies conducted at a particular facility during a particular period. Studies that were referenced but never described in the surviving record, studies whose results were apparently known within the institution but whose protocols, whose data, whose subjects cannot be identified. The committee cataloged these references. They listed them in an appendix. They noted that they could not determine, on the basis of available evidence, whether the reference studies involved human subjects or what the nature of those studies was. The references exist. The studies behind them are, as far as the committee could determine, not retrievable. How many studies? It is hard to say. The appendix is not short, and each entry in it represents a thread that the committee pulled on and found no end to. Not a dramatic dead end, not a locked vault or a stonewalling official, just an absence. The place where the record should continue, but does not. There is something about that image that I find stays with me more than any individual experiment. The idea of an appendix full of references to things that cannot be found, a catalog of pointers that point nowhere. A list of questions without answers, compiled by a committee that was specifically empowered to ask those questions and was still unable to answer them. It suggests that the record of human radiation experiments, as extensive as it is, as disturbing as it is, may not be complete. Not because of any dramatic conspiracy, but because the systems that produced the experiments were not designed to produce complete records. They were designed to produce results, and results were recorded. And the rest, the context, the reasoning, the human dimensions of what was being done, was often not. What we are left with is a record that tells us a great deal about what happened and considerably less about why it was allowed to happen. And in the spaces where the why should be, there is mostly quiet. I think that quiet is worth listening to, not because it contains hidden answers, but because it reminds us that the absence of a record is not the absence of an event. Things happened that were not written down. Decisions were made that were not documented. People were affected in ways that were not tracked. And the people who could tell us, the subjects, the researchers, the administrators, the soldiers, the prisoners, the children, are in most cases no longer available to ask. The record is what it is, and what it is, even now, is incomplete. Most people who know the name Oppenheimer know it from one of two images. Either the photograph, the thin face, the hat, the cigarette, the look that seems to carry something heavy behind the eyes, or the quote, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The line from the Bhagavad Gita that Oppenheimer said he thought of when the Trinity test lit up the New Mexico desert. Both images are real. Both are also, in a way, too neat. They reduce a complicated person to an icon, and icons are easier to look at than people. The real Oppenheimer was brilliant, charismatic, politically clumsy, emotionally complicated, and ultimately destroyed not by a bomb, but by a hearing. The hearing is what I want to talk about. Not because it is unknown. It has been written about extensively, dramatized, analyzed from every angle, but because the records from it, and the records surrounding it, and the records that were used to build the case against him, tell a story about how institutions handle people who become inconvenient. And some of those records were kept from the public for a very long time. Let me back up a little. J. Robert Oppenheimer was the scientific director of the Los Alamos Laboratory during the Manhattan Project. He was, by most accounts, extraordinary in that role. Not the best physicist on the project, that distinction probably belongs to someone like Enrico Fermi or Hans Bethe, but the best leader. He had an ability to manage egos, to synthesize ideas across disciplines, to keep a sprawling and temperamental group of scientists focused on a common goal. General Groves, who was not generous with praise, considered Oppenheimer indispensable. After the war, Oppenheimer became the most prominent scientific voice in American nuclear policy. He chaired the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission. He was consulted by presidents. He was, for a period, arguably the most influential scientist in the country. And then, in 1954, he was brought before a personnel security board and subjected to a hearing that resulted in the revocation of his security clearance. The hearing lasted nearly 4 weeks. The transcript runs to nearly 1,000 pages. It is a document that, even now, is difficult to read without a sense of something going wrong. The stated reason for the hearing was a set of concerns about Oppenheimer's past associations. He had been involved with left-wing causes in the 1930s. He had friends who were members of the Communist Party. His brother Frank had been a party member. His former girlfriend Jean Tatlock had been connected to communist circles. These facts were known. They had been known when Oppenheimer was given his clearance during the Manhattan Project. Groves had been aware of them and had decided that Oppenheimer's value to the project outweighed the risk. So why, nearly a decade after the war ended, were these same facts suddenly grounds for revoking his clearance? The surface answer is that the political climate had changed. By 1954, McCarthyism was at its peak. The Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb in 1949, years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. The Rosenberg trial had stoked public fear about Soviet espionage. The political environment was one in which past associations with the left were treated not as youthful indiscretions, but as evidence of ongoing disloyalty. That is true as far as it goes, but it does not fully explain why Oppenheimer specifically was targeted. Plenty of scientists had left-wing pasts. The physics community in the 1930s had been broadly sympathetic to socialist and progressive causes. If past associations alone were sufficient grounds for revocation, half the scientific establishment would have lost their clearances. What made Oppenheimer different was not his past, it was his present. Specifically, his opposition to the hydrogen bomb. In 1949, after the Soviet atomic test, there was an intense debate within the American defense establishment about whether to pursue a thermonuclear weapon, a hydrogen bomb, vastly more powerful than the fission weapons used on Japan. Edward Teller, a physicist who had been pushing for thermonuclear research since the Manhattan Project days, was a strong advocate. So were many military leaders and politicians who saw the hydrogen bomb as essential to maintaining American nuclear superiority. Oppenheimer disagreed. As chair of the General Advisory Committee, he led the committee in producing a report that recommended against a crash program to develop the hydrogen bomb. The report argued on both strategic and moral grounds. Strategically, the committee questioned whether a weapon of such enormous destructive power had any legitimate military use. Morally, the report described the hydrogen bomb as a weapon of genocide language that was unusual for an official advisory document and that carried real weight. Truman overruled the recommendation. The hydrogen bomb program went forward. It succeeded. The first thermonuclear device was tested in 1952. It was roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Oppenheimer had lost the policy argument, but his opposition was on the record. And the people who had won the argument, Teller, Lewis Strauss, who was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, various military and political figures who had pushed for the hydrogen bomb, did not forget. Lewis Strauss is a figure worth paying attention to in this story. He was a businessman, a political operator, and a man who held grudges with remarkable tenacity. He had clashed with Oppenheimer on multiple occasions, not just over the hydrogen bomb, but over broader questions of nuclear policy and the AEC's direction. Their relationship had deteriorated into something personal and bitter. And Strauss, as AEC chairman, was in a position to act on that bitterness. In late 1953, Strauss received a letter from William Borden, a former staff director of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, alleging that Oppenheimer was likely a Soviet agent. Borden's letter was based on the same old information about Oppenheimer's past associations, repackaged in the most damning possible framing. There was no new evidence, but the letter gave Strauss a pretext. Strauss presented the letter to President Eisenhower. Eisenhower ordered a blank wall placed between Oppenheimer and classified information pending a review, and the security hearing was set in motion. What followed was not, strictly speaking, a trial. It was an administrative proceeding. Oppenheimer was not charged with a crime. He was not entitled to the protections that a criminal defendant would have. The rules of evidence did not apply, and the process was, in ways that became clear only later, stacked against him from the beginning. Oppenheimer's lawyers were not given full access to the evidence against him. Classified documents were used in the hearing that Oppenheimer's legal team was not cleared to see. The government's case relied heavily on surveillance records, wiretap transcripts, reports from informants, summaries of monitored conversations that had been collected over more than a decade. The surveillance had been extensive. Oppenheimer's phone had been tapped during and after the Manhattan Project. His conversations with friends, colleagues, and his wife had been recorded and transcribed and filed. And here is where the records become particularly interesting. The FBI's file on Oppenheimer was enormous. It had been building since the early 1940s. J. Edgar Hoover had personally taken an interest in Oppenheimer, viewing him as a security risk from the beginning and chafing at Grove's decision to grant him clearance despite the Bureau's objections. The FBI file contained surveillance transcripts, informant reports, background investigations, and assessments that painted Oppenheimer in the most unfavorable light possible. Not all of this material was made available at the hearing. Some of it was. Some of it was provided selectively, in ways that supported the government's case while omitting context that might have complicated it. And some of it was shared with the government's attorneys, but not with Oppenheimer's, a procedural asymmetry that Oppenheimer's defenders have pointed to as fundamentally unfair. The hearing transcript itself was classified after the proceedings. The AEC published a redacted version, but the full transcript, including classified portions, was not publicly available for decades. When it was finally released, first in partial form, then more completely, it revealed details that the redacted version had omitted, details about the surveillance, details about the way evidence had been handled, details about the interactions between Strauss, the FBI, and the hearing board that suggested a level of coordination that went beyond an ordinary security review. I want to be careful with that last point. Coordination between the AEC and the FBI during a security proceeding is not, in itself, improper. These agencies were supposed to work together on security matters. The question is whether the coordination in this case was directed toward a genuinely open inquiry into Oppenheimer's loyalty or toward a predetermined outcome. The people who have studied the hearing most carefully tend toward the latter view, not unanimously. There are historians who argue that the proceeding, while imperfect, was a reasonable response to legitimate security concerns in a dangerous time. But the weight of the evidence, including evidence that only became available as records were declassified, points toward something less neutral. There is a document that surfaced relatively recently, a memo from Strauss that indicates he was in communication with the hearing board's counsel about strategy during the proceedings. If accurate, this suggests that the person who initiated the hearing was also influencing its conduct, a conflict of interest that would be disqualifying in most legal contexts. The memo's existence was not known during the hearing. It was not available to Oppenheimer's lawyers. It came out later through the slow, grinding process of declassification and archival research that has gradually filled in the picture of what happened in 1954. And that is the thing about the Oppenheimer case. It keeps changing. Not in its broad outlines, those have been known for decades. But in its details, as records come out, the picture shifts. nuances emerge. Things that seemed like fair process reveal themselves as something else. And the question of what the hearing was really about, loyalty or politics or personal animosity or institutional self-protection, becomes harder to answer with a single word. In 2022, the United States government formally vacated the 1954 decision to revoke Oppenheimer's security clearance. The Secretary of Energy issued a statement acknowledging that the process had been flawed and that Oppenheimer had been treated unfairly. It was a symbolic act, nearly 70 years after the fact, and nearly 60 years after Oppenheimer's death. Symbolic acts are not nothing. But they are also not the same as a full accounting, and the full accounting in this case is still constrained by the incompleteness of the record, because while much has come out, not everything has. There are still portions of the FBI's Oppenheimer file that are redacted. There are still documents related to the hearing that are not publicly available. There are still questions about who knew what, and when, and why certain decisions were made that the available records do not fully answer. We are going to keep sitting with those questions in the next part. Because the Oppenheimer case is not just about one man, it is about what happens when an institution decides that a person's influence has become a problem, and the tools it uses to solve that problem, and the records it leaves behind and does not leave behind of how the solution was carried out. There is a moment in the hearing transcript that I keep coming back to. It is not the most dramatic moment. It is not the one that gets quoted in documentaries, but it is the one that, for me, captures something essential about what was happening in that room. Oppenheimer was being questioned about a conversation he had in 1943 during the Manhattan Project with a man named Håkon Chevalier. Chevalier was a friend, a French literature professor at Berkeley. According to Oppenheimer, Chevalier had approached him at a dinner party and mentioned that a mutual acquaintance, a man named George Eltenton, had suggested there might be a way to pass information to the Soviets. Oppenheimer said he had immediately rejected the idea. He said he had told Chevalier it was a terrible thing to suggest. He said he had then reported the approach to security officials. All of this was known. It had been known since 1943. It was in the record. The problem was that Oppenheimer's account of the incident had changed over time. In his initial report to security officers, he had elaborated on the story, adding details that he later admitted were fabrications. He said he had embellished the account, made it sound like a more organized approach than it actually was. He described what he called a cock and bull story. When later asked to provide the true version, he did. He identified Chevalier. He said the conversation had been brief and casual and that he had shut it down immediately. The hearing board spent an extraordinary amount of time on this incident. They returned to it again and again. They asked Oppenheimer to explain the discrepancy between his initial account and his later one. They asked him why he had fabricated details. They asked him whether his fabrication indicated a pattern of dishonesty. Oppenheimer's answers were halting, uncertain. He used the word idiot to describe his own behavior. He seemed genuinely bewildered by his earlier choices, unable to fully explain why he had told the embellished version in the first place. His responses were not smooth. They were not the responses of a man who had prepared a polished defense. They were the responses of a man trying to understand his own past behavior and failing, at least partly, to do so. Reading that section of the transcript, you can feel the room turning, not because Oppenheimer was caught in a lie. The lie was from 1943. He had corrected it. The true version was on the record. But the fact that he had lied at all, even once, even years ago, even about something he subsequently corrected, became a crack that the government's attorneys widened into a chasm. If he lied then, could he be trusted now? If he fabricated details once, what else might he have fabricated? The logic was simple, relentless, and devastating. And the thing is, from a purely procedural standpoint, it was not an unreasonable line of questioning. Security clearances depend on trust. Honesty is a legitimate criterion. A documented instance of dishonesty, even one that was later corrected, is a legitimate concern, but context matters. And the context here was that the Chevalier incident had been known, investigated, and resolved a decade earlier. Groves had known about it. The security apparatus had known about it. Oppenheimer had been granted and maintained his clearance for years after the incident was on the record. It had not been considered disqualifying at the time. It was being treated as disqualifying now, 10 years later, in a proceeding that had been triggered not by new security concerns, but by a policy disagreement about the hydrogen bomb. That is the gap between the stated reason and the actual reason that runs through the entire hearing. On paper, the proceeding was about security. In practice, it was about influence. And the records, the ones that have come out over the decades, increasingly support that reading. One of the things that emerged from later declassifications was the extent to which Edward Teller's testimony shaped the outcome. Teller appeared as a witness. He was not hostile in the obvious sense. He did not accuse Oppenheimer of disloyalty or espionage. What he said was more careful than that, and in some ways more damaging. He said he would feel more secure if the nation's nuclear policy were in other hands. That single sentence was probably the most consequential piece of testimony in the hearing. Because Teller was a respected scientist, a key figure in the hydrogen bomb program, and his statement carried a weight that more extreme accusations might not have. He was not calling Oppenheimer a traitor. He was expressing a preference. And that preference, stated calmly and without apparent malice, gave the hearing board permission to do what it was arguably assembled to do. Teller's relationship with Oppenheimer never recovered. Within the physics community, Teller became something of a pariah for his testimony. Many scientists viewed what he had done as a betrayal, not just of Oppenheimer personally, but of the principle that scientific disagreement should not be weaponized in security proceedings. Teller spent decades defending his testimony and insisting that he had spoken honestly and out of genuine concern. Maybe he had. People are complicated. Teller may have genuinely believed that Oppenheimer's judgment on nuclear policy was wrong and that his continued influence was dangerous. The fact that this belief aligned neatly with Teller's own professional interests. He had been fighting for the hydrogen bomb for years, and Oppenheimer had been the primary obstacle, does not automatically make the belief insincere, but the hearing was not a forum for policy disagreement. It was a security proceeding, and using a security proceeding to resolve a policy disagreement is a category error that has consequences beyond the individual case. It sends a message to every other scientist, every other advisor, every other person in a position to influence policy. If you dissent, this is what can happen to you. Not a debate, not a vote, a hearing, a file, a reclassification of your loyalty based on your opinions. The chilling effect of the Oppenheimer hearing on the scientific community is something that historians have written about at length. It is difficult to measure precisely because chilling effects are by nature invisible. They consist of things that do not happen, opinions that are not expressed, positions that are not taken, but the anecdotal evidence is substantial. Scientists who had been willing to engage with nuclear policy became more cautious. Advisory committees became less willing to challenge military and political preferences. The range of acceptable opinion within the nuclear establishment narrowed, that word again, narrowing, in ways that persisted for years. Some of that narrowing was probably inevitable. The Cold War was intensifying. The political environment was hostile to dissent of any kind. McCarthyism was affecting every sector of American public life, not just the scientific community. But the Oppenheimer hearing was a specific, visible, high-profile demonstration of what could happen to someone who dissented, and specific demonstrations have specific effects. I want to talk about the records now, not the hearing transcript, which is extensive and largely available, but the records that surrounded the hearing. The investigative files, the surveillance records, the communications between the AEC, the FBI, and the White House. These records have come out in stages. Some were released in the 1970s during the post-Watergate wave of transparency legislation. Some came out in the 1980s and 1990s through FOIA requests. Some came out in the 2000s and 2010s as classification reviews were conducted, and some came out as recently as the last few years, as researchers have continued to push for access to materials that were still being withheld. Each release has added something, not always something dramatic. Sometimes just a detail, a memo that shows the timing of a decision, a communication that reveals who was talking to whom and when. But cumulatively, these details have shifted the understanding of the hearing from an imperfect but legitimate security review to something more troubling. One category of records that has been particularly revealing is the communications between Lewis Strauss and J. Edgar Hoover. The two men had a relationship that predated the hearing. They shared a mutual distrust of Oppenheimer and a mutual interest in seeing his influence curtailed. The records of their communications, some direct, some through intermediaries, show a level of coordination in the lead-up to the hearing that goes beyond routine interagency cooperation. Hoover provided Strauss with information from the FBI's Oppenheimer file. That information was used to prepare the case against Oppenheimer. Some of it was shared with the government's attorneys in the hearing. Some of it was apparently used to anticipate Oppenheimer's defense strategy. There are indications, not conclusive, but suggestive, that Oppenheimer's own conversations with his lawyers were monitored, and that information from those conversations was available to the other side. If that is true, if the government was surveilling Oppenheimer's privileged communications with his attorneys and using that information in the hearing, it would represent a fundamental violation of due process. even in an administrative proceeding, even under the relaxed standards of a security review. The evidence for this is not airtight. It is based on circumstantial patterns, moments in the hearing where the government's attorneys seem to anticipate Oppenheimer's responses in ways that suggested advanced knowledge. It is based on records showing that the wiretap on Oppenheimer's phone was active during the period when he was preparing his defense. It is based on the absence of any record showing that the wiretap was suspended during the hearing, which would have been the appropriate step if privileged communications were to be protected. Absence of evidence is not evidence. I know that. But in a context where surveillance was demonstrably occurring, the absence of any documentation showing that the surveillance was paused during the hearing is, at minimum, noteworthy. The 2022 vacatur of the decision acknowledged that the process was flawed. But it did not, and probably could not, address all of the questions that the records raise. Some of those questions may never be fully answered because the records that would answer them may not exist, may not have survived, or may still be withheld. What we are left with is a story that is largely known but not entirely understood. A story where the broad shape is clear. A man was targeted for his influence, subjected to a proceeding that was stacked against him, and stripped of his status in a way that served political rather than security purposes, but where the specific mechanics of how that was accomplished are still in some of their details obscured. Oppenheimer himself seemed to understand this. In the years after the hearing, he did not campaign for his clearance to be restored. He did not write a tell-all account or wage a public relations battle. He retreated into academic life, continued his work in physics, and aged rapidly. People who knew him described a man who seemed diminished, not broken exactly, but reduced, as if something essential had been taken from him that could not be given back. He died of throat cancer in 1967 at the age of 62. He had been a heavy smoker all his life. The cancer was not connected to radiation. It was ordinary, mundane, a body wearing out in the usual way. After his death, the questions about the hearing continued. They have continued for more than half a century. And each new document that surfaces adds a layer, adjusts an angle, complicates what we thought we already understood. That is how records work. They do not close stories, they open them further. Every answer reveals a new question, and every new question sends you looking for another document that may or may not exist. The Oppenheimer file is still not fully open. Parts of it remain classified or redacted. The full FBI file has not been released in its entirety. The full record of communications between the AEC and the White House regarding the hearing has not been made public. These are not dramatic withholdings. They are routine, bureaucratic, consistent with the general pace of declassification for records of this era and this sensitivity. But they mean the story is not finished. The record is still incomplete, and the man at the center of it is long dead and cannot speak for himself. All that remains is the paper. And the paper, as always, tells part of the truth and keeps part of it in silence. The decision to use the bomb is probably the most debated decision in modern history. Libraries exist on this subject. Entire academic careers have been built around a single question: was it necessary? I am not going to try to answer that tonight. What I want to look at is something narrower, the targeting process, how specific cities were chosen, and what the records of that process do and do not show. In the spring of 1945, a group called the Target Committee met to determine which Japanese cities would be struck. The committee included military officers, scientists, and weapons specialists. They met several times between April and May. They discussed criteria. They considered factors like the size of the city, its military significance, its geography, and whether it had already been damaged by conventional bombing. That last criterion is important. The committee specifically wanted targets that had not been heavily bombed. They wanted cities that were relatively intact. The reason, stated plainly in the minutes that survive, was that an undamaged city would better demonstrate the destructive power of the weapon. The bomb's effect needed to be measurable. A city already in ruins would not provide a clear picture. There is something cold about reading that reasoning written out, not because the people involved were monsters. They were making calculations during a war that had already killed millions. But the calculation itself, choosing a city partly because it was still whole, because its intactness would make for a better demonstration, sits uncomfortably in the mind. The minutes from the Target Committee meetings exist. Some of them were declassified relatively early. Others took longer to surface. And the minutes that are available are not complete in the way you might expect for a decision of this magnitude. Some meetings have detailed records. Others have summaries that are brief to the point of opacity. Certain discussions are referenced but not described. Kyoto was originally on the list. It was removed, reportedly at the personal insistence of Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had visited the city and valued its cultural significance. That story is well documented. But the internal discussion around Kyoto's removal, who argued for keeping it, what the counterarguments were, how the decision was finalized, is less fully preserved than you might expect. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were ultimately selected. The reasons are documented in broad terms. But researchers have noted that the full deliberative record, the complete set of discussions, assessments, and communications that led to the final selections, has gaps, not dramatic ones, pieces missing from a sequence, meetings that apparently occurred but left no surviving minutes. Communications between the Target Committee and higher-level decision-makers that are referenced in other documents but cannot be located independently. It is possible those records were never created. Wartime decisions sometimes happen fast, in conversations that no one writes down. That is normal. But it is also possible that records were created and did not survive the transition from wartime files to post-war archives. And in the absence of those records, the full story of how these specific cities were chosen remains slightly less complete than the significance of the decision would seem to demand. After Hiroshima was bombed on August 6, 1945, survey teams were sent in. Their job was to document the destruction, to measure it, to photograph it, to collect data that would be used to assess the weapon's effectiveness and to plan for future use if necessary. Those survey teams produced extensive reports. Some of that material was made public relatively quickly. The images of the devastation became some of the most widely seen photographs of the 20th century, but the full survey data, particularly the medical data, the data on human casualties, the assessments of radiation effects on survivors, was handled differently. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted a detailed study of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Their reports are publicly available now, but portions of the medical and radiological data were classified for years. The concern, officially, was that detailed information about radiation effects could be useful to adversaries. That rationale is not unreasonable on its face, but it also had the effect of controlling the narrative about what the bombs had actually done to human beings. Japanese researchers and physicians who were studying the survivors, the Hibakusha, found that their access to American survey data was restricted. They were generating their own data, of course. But the American data, collected with resources and instruments that the devastated Japanese medical system did not have, was held separately and was not shared. There is something uncomfortable about that. The people who dropped the bomb also controlled the most comprehensive data about what the bomb did. And they restricted access to that data for reasons that were partly legitimate and partly, it is hard not to suspect, related to managing the political and moral implications of the weapon's use. When the data did come out, over years and decades, it confirmed what Japanese physicians had been observing all along. The radiation effects were severe, long-lasting, and affected populations that extended well beyond the immediate blast zone. None of this was a surprise to the people who had been studying the survivors on the ground, but the official American data provided a scale and precision that the Japanese studies, conducted under impossible conditions, could not match. The question of why that data was restricted for as long as it was does not have a single clean answer. Security concerns were real. Bureaucratic inertia was real. And the discomfort of possessing detailed evidence of what your own weapon did to civilian populations, evidence that you collected yourself, systematically, in the aftermath. That discomfort was probably real too, even if it was never articulated in any memo that has survived. The targeting records and the survey data together form a strange pair. On one side, the incomplete record of how the cities were chosen. On the other, the restricted record of what happened to them after they were hit. The decision and its consequences both partially obscured, not fully hidden. Just not fully visible for longer than seems necessary. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949. American intelligence had predicted it would take them much longer. The speed of the Soviet program was, in itself, a kind of evidence. They had help. How much help and from whom is a question that has been partially answered and partially not. The names we know are well established. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born British physicist who worked at Los Alamos and passed detailed weapons design information to Soviet intelligence. He was caught in 1950, confessed, and served 9 years in a British prison. David Greenglass, a machinist at Los Alamos, who provided information through his sister Ethel Rosenberg and her husband Julius. The Rosenbergs were executed in 1953. Theodore Hall, a young physicist at Los Alamos who independently contacted Soviet intelligence and provided information about the implosion design used in the plutonium bomb. Hall was identified through the VENONA project, but was never prosecuted. VENONA is central to this story. It was a signals intelligence program run by the Army and later the NSA that intercepted and decrypted Soviet diplomatic communications from the 1940s. The decrypted messages, processed over many years, identified Soviet agents operating in the United States. Some of those agents were inside the Manhattan Project. The VENONA transcripts were declassified in 1995. They are available now and have been studied extensively. They confirmed some things that were suspected, revealed others that were not, and left a number of threads unresolved. Unresolved is the key word, because the VENONA material is fragmentary. Not every message was intercepted. Not every intercepted message was decrypted, and not every decrypted message could be fully interpreted. Soviet intelligence used code names for their agents, and matching those code names to real identities was a painstaking process that sometimes produced confident identifications and sometimes produced only possibilities. There are code names in the VENONA transcripts that have never been definitively matched to real people. Some of those code names appear in messages related to atomic intelligence. They refer to individuals who apparently had access to information about the bomb program and who were apparently providing that information to Moscow. Who they were, we do not know. Not for certain. Researchers have proposed candidates. Some proposals are well supported, others are speculative. And the records that might resolve the identifications, the full FBI counterintelligence files from the period, the full NSA analytical files on VENONA have not been completely released. Parts of the VENONA archive remain redacted. The redactions are not extensive, but they exist, and they tend to cluster around identifications that were apparently never confirmed, which means the most interesting parts, the parts where an agent was detected but not identified, are also the parts that are least accessible. There is a reasonable question to ask here, which is whether unidentified code names necessarily mean unidentified spies. Maybe some of those code names referred to people who were peripheral, who provided low-level information, who were contacts rather than agents. The Soviet intelligence apparatus was large and not always efficient, and not every person they communicated about was necessarily a significant source. That is possible, but some of the unmatched code names appear in contexts that suggest access to substantive technical information. Not administrative details or gossip, but actual weapons-related data. The messages discuss the information these sources provided in terms that suggest the Soviets considered it valuable. And the fact that the FBI and NSA were unable to identify these individuals, or identified them but chose not to prosecute, or identified them, and the identification remains classified, leaves an open question that has never been fully closed. The counterintelligence story of the Manhattan Project has a quality of incompleteness that is different from the other gaps we have discussed. The health records are incomplete because of poor documentation practices. The targeting records are incomplete because of wartime informality. But the counterintelligence records are incomplete at least partly by design. Intelligence agencies do not release information about sources and methods willingly, even decades after the fact. The VENONA program itself was kept secret for nearly 50 years. Its existence was not acknowledged until 1995. If VENONA could be kept secret for that long, the question naturally arises, what else from the same period remains secret? Not as a conspiracy theory, as a straightforward observation about how intelligence agencies operate. They keep things. That is what they do. And the timelines on which they release those things are measured in decades, not years. The FBI's files on Manhattan Project security investigations have been released in part through FOIA, but researchers who have worked with these files describe them as heavily processed. Pages are missing. Sections are redacted. Cross-references point to files that are not included in the release. The picture you get is real but incomplete, like looking at a photograph where certain faces have been carefully smudged out. Were there spies inside the Manhattan Project beyond the ones we know about? The honest answer is that the available evidence suggests it is possible, but does not confirm it. The VENONA material points to unidentified sources. The FBI files have gaps that are consistent with either ongoing classification or information that was never fully developed. And the Soviet archives, which might resolve some of these questions, remain largely inaccessible to Western researchers. What we are left with is a counterintelligence story that has a beginning and a middle but not quite an end. The known spies were caught or identified. The unknown ones, if they existed, remain unknown, and the records that might change that on both the American and the Soviet side are still, for the most part, behind closed doors. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, the first nuclear device was detonated in the desert of southern New Mexico. The site was called Trinity. The device was called the Gadget. The explosion was equivalent to roughly 21,000 tons of TNT. The scientists who were present described it in terms that ranged from awe to terror. Oppenheimer's quote about the Bhagavad Gita comes from this moment. Others described it more plainly. A flash brighter than anything they had imagined. A heat they could feel on their skin from miles away. A cloud that rose and kept rising. What is discussed less often is what happened on the ground around the test site. Not at the site itself, which was federal land, cleared and controlled, but in the surrounding communities. Ranches, small towns, families living in the New Mexico desert who had no idea what was about to happen and were not warned. The fallout from Trinity drifted. It moved with the wind, as fallout does, and it settled on land and homes and livestock and people. The area downwind of the test site was not evacuated. The people living there were not told to stay indoors. They were not told anything, because the test was secret and acknowledging fallout would have meant acknowledging the test. Some of those people saw the flash. Some of them felt the ground shake. Some of them noticed, in the days that followed, a fine white ash settling on their property, on their water tanks, on the grass their cattle were eating. They did not know what it was. Decades later, many of them were sick. Cancers at rates that seemed disproportionate, thyroid problems, autoimmune conditions, the kinds of illnesses associated with radiation exposure, appearing in clusters in communities downwind of the test site. The question of whether the Trinity fallout caused those illnesses has been studied, debated, and never fully resolved. And the reason it has never been fully resolved is, in significant part, because the data that would resolve it was not collected at the time and has not been reconstructible since. The Manhattan Project scientists monitored the Trinity test extensively from a technical standpoint. They measured the yield. They measured the blast effects. They measured the radiation at the site itself. But the monitoring of off-site fallout, the radiation that left the test site and drifted over civilian areas, was limited. There were some monitoring stations. They recorded some data. But the coverage was sparse, the equipment was basic by later standards, and the results were classified. The classified fallout data that does exist has come out over the years, in pieces, through declassification efforts and FOIA requests. What it shows is that radiation levels in some downwind areas were significant. Not catastrophic in the immediate sense, but high enough to raise concerns about long-term health effects, particularly for people who were exposed repeatedly through contaminated water, food, and soil. What the data does not show, because it was never collected, is what the actual exposures were for specific individuals and communities. There was no systematic health monitoring of the downwind population. No one went to those ranches and measured what the residents had absorbed. No one tracked their health outcomes over time. The people were invisible to the program that had exposed them. The people who lived downwind of Trinity have been seeking recognition for decades. They call themselves the Chilerosa Basin Downwinders. They have testified before Congress. They have organized, advocated, documented their own health histories in the absence of government data. They have done, essentially, the epidemiological work that should have been done at the time, using their own memories and medical records and family histories as the raw material. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, passed in 1990, provided payments to certain populations affected by nuclear testing. Uranium miners, people who lived downwind of the Nevada test site, military participants in atmospheric tests, but the Trinity downwinders were not included. The law did not cover them. Despite living closer to a nuclear detonation than almost any civilian population in American history, they were left out of the compensation framework. The reason, officially, was insufficient data. There was not enough documentation of their exposure to meet the legal threshold for compensation. And the reason there was not enough documentation was that no one had collected it at the time. The absence of data, created by the government's failure to monitor the population it had exposed, became the basis for denying that the exposure had occurred in a compensable way. That circularity is hard to sit with. The government did not collect the data. Therefore, the data does not exist. Therefore, the exposure cannot be proven. Therefore, no compensation is owed. Each step in that chain is technically defensible. And the result is that people who were almost certainly harmed by a government program have been unable to obtain recognition of that harm through the systems the government established. There have been efforts to change this. Legislation has been introduced multiple times to expand the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to include the Trinity downwinders. Some of those efforts have come close. As of recent years, amendments have been passed in some form, though the path to full implementation has been complicated by political and budgetary considerations. Meanwhile, the original downwinders are dying. They have been dying for years. The generation that was alive in 1945, that saw the flash and touched the ash, is nearly gone. Their children, some of whom have their own health problems that they attribute to their parents' exposure, are aging. The window for first-hand testimony is closing, and the records remain what they have always been, partial. The technical data from the test itself is extensive. The fallout monitoring data is sparse. The health data for the affected population is almost non-existent as a government-collected data set. What exists has been assembled after the fact, by the communities themselves, by sympathetic researchers, by advocacy organizations working with limited resources. There is something about Trinity that feels like a distillation of everything we have been talking about throughout this story. The gap between what was known internally and what was acknowledged publicly. The failure to document what was happening to the most vulnerable people affected by the program. The way that failure compounds over time, making accountability progressively harder as the years pass, and the evidence that was never collected becomes permanently uncollectible. The desert around the Trinity site is open to visitors twice a year. You can go there. You can stand at ground zero, which is marked with a modest stone obelisk. The radiation levels at the site itself have returned to near background. The land looks empty, quiet, recovered, but the communities around it have not recovered in the same way. Their losses are not visible from the monument. Their stories are not told by the obelisk. And their records, such as they are, exist mostly in their own keeping, in boxes and folders and family albums, maintained by people who understood that if they did not preserve this history themselves, no one else would. We have been sitting with gaps for a while now. Gaps in files, gaps in archives, gaps in the stories that institutions told about themselves, and the stories that the people inside those institutions were allowed to tell. And I think at this point, the natural impulse is to want to draw a conclusion. To say, here is what it all means. Here is the answer. I am not going to do that. Not because I am being evasive, but because I genuinely do not think there is a single answer. The missing records of the Manhattan Project are not one thing. They are many things. Some of them are the product of ordinary bureaucratic entropy, the natural decay of institutional memory over time, the boxes that get mislabeled, the filing systems that change, the transfers that lose track of things. That is real. It happens in every large organization. It is not sinister. It is just what happens when human beings manage enormous volumes of information over decades. Some of the gaps are the product of deliberate classification. Information that was restricted for reasons that made sense at the time, and that has been slowly, unevenly released as those reasons have faded. The restricted data category, the intelligence files, the counterintelligence records, these are cases where the government made conscious decisions about what to withhold, and those decisions, whether you agree with them or not, followed a logic that was at least internally consistent. And some of the gaps are harder to categorize: the health records that were never collected, the worker exposures that were never monitored, the community impacts that were never assessed. These are not cases of records being classified or lost. They are cases of records never existing in the first place. Information that was not gathered because gathering it was not a priority, or because gathering it would have created obligations that the institution preferred not to have. That last category troubles me the most. Because a classified document can eventually be declassified, a lost document can sometimes be found, but a document that was never created cannot be recovered. The information it would have contained is gone, and the people whose lives that information would have described are increasingly gone too. There is something worth noticing about how these different kinds of gaps interact. The deliberate classification creates a framework of secrecy. The bureaucratic entropy operates within that framework, compounding the effects of classification with the ordinary losses of time and institutional change. And the failure to collect certain data in the first place means that even if every classified document were released tomorrow, the record would still be incomplete. The picture would still have holes. Those holes are not evenly distributed. We have seen that throughout this story. They cluster around the people who had the least power, the workers who were not told what they were making, the communities that were not warned about fallout, the patients who were not told what was being injected into them, the soldiers who were not given dosimeters, the prisoners who were not given real choices. That pattern is not unique to the Manhattan Project. It is a pattern that runs through the history of large institutional programs generally. The people at the margins are the least documented, the least protected, and the least likely to have their experiences preserved in any official record. But in the context of a nuclear weapons program, a program whose consequences were measured in radiation doses and cancer rates and genetic damage, the stakes of that pattern are unusually high. I have been thinking about something while putting this together. About what it means to carry incomplete knowledge, not as a researcher or a historian, but as a person. As someone lying in the dark, thinking about things that happened before you were born, trying to understand a story that does not have a clean ending. We want stories to resolve. That is a deep human need. We want the missing file to be found, the secret to be revealed, the guilty party to be named. We want the gap to close, and sometimes it does. Documents surface, archives open, the picture becomes clearer. But sometimes it does not. Sometimes the gap is permanent. The records were never created, or they were destroyed, or they exist somewhere that no one has looked, or they exist somewhere that no one is allowed to look. And you are left holding the question without the answer, and you have to decide what to do with that. One option is to fill the gap with certainty you do not have. To decide that the absence of evidence is evidence of something specific, a conspiracy, a cover-up, a deliberate erasure. That is tempting. It gives the story shape. It provides a villain and a motive and a sense that someone, somewhere, knows the truth. But I do not think that is honest. Not in this case. The gaps in the Manhattan Project record are real, and some of them are troubling, and some of them cluster in ways that suggest something more than accident. But suggesting something is not the same as proving it. And filling gaps with assumptions, however satisfying, is not the same as filling them with evidence. The other option is to sit with the uncertainty, to acknowledge that there are things we do not know, may never know, and that the not knowing is itself a kind of information. It tells us something about the institutions that produced these records, about their priorities, about what they considered worth documenting and what they did not, about who mattered to them and who did not. The Manhattan Project changed the world in ways that are still unfolding. The weapons it produced still exist. The institutions it created still operate. the classification systems it established still govern how information about nuclear weapons is handled. The patterns it set, the compartmentalization, the secrecy, the prioritization of mission over transparency, are still embedded in the way the American national security state functions, and the gaps in its record are not sealed behind some wall in the past. They are ongoing. They affect people now. The downwinders still seeking compensation, the veterans still trying to document their exposure, the families of workers still trying to understand what their parents were subjected to. For these people, the missing records are not a historical curiosity. They are an obstacle to justice or to closure or simply to understanding. I do not have a way to fix that. Nobody does, probably. Some of the missing information is genuinely irretrievable. The people are gone. The data was never collected. The moment has passed. But I think there is value in naming it, in saying, clearly and without dramatization, that the record of one of the most significant programs in modern history is incomplete, that the incompleteness is not random, that it has a shape, and the shape tells us something about who was protected and who was not, what was valued and what was not, what was considered worth preserving and what was allowed to disappear. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is just history, honestly described. History with its gaps visible rather than papered over. History that admits what it does not know. It is late now, or early, depending on how you think about it. The rain is still falling, or maybe it stopped and you did not notice. These things, the questions, the silences, the records that are and are not there, they will still be here tomorrow. They are patient. They have been waiting for decades already. You do not need to solve them tonight. Nobody can. But maybe it is enough to have sat with them for a while, to have listened, to have let the questions exist without forcing them into answers they do not yet fit. That is enough for now. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let the questions settle. They are heavy, but they are not urgent. They have been waiting a long time. They can wait a little longer. And maybe somewhere in an archive, in an uncatalogued box on an unremarkable shelf, there is a piece of paper with something written on it that would change the shape of this story. Maybe someone will find it someday. Maybe they already have, and we just do not know yet. Or maybe it is not there. Maybe it never was. Either way, the story continues. Quietly. In the gaps, good night.